There is a city beneath Sydney, not a rumour, not a legend passed between people who have had too much to drink and not enough sleep. A city with streets that were laid before anyone alive today was born, with walls that were cut from sandstone by hands that moved with purpose, not desperation, with spaces that were designed to hold something or someone and then sealed so completely that the ceiling itself became the only story anyone was allowed to tell. Most people who live in Sydney do not know this. They ride the trains, they walk through the tunnels, they stand on platforms and stare at the curved walls of the underground, and they do not ask why those walls are curved that particular way, or who decided the tunnels should go where they go, or why certain sections of certain lines feel different in a way that is hard to name. Older, maybe, quieter, like the air in them has not moved in a long time. Some of them have noticed things. Workers who go into maintenance shafts and come back out saying very little. Engineers who file reports that do not get answered. Historians who request access to archival documents and are told those documents are under review. Under review for how long, they ask. Nobody says. There are sections of the Sydney Underground that have not been publicly documented. There are chambers that appear on no current map. There are construction records from the late 19th century that describe excavations proceeding in directions and at depths that do not match any tunnel that exists today. And there is a question that sits underneath all of this, patient and unmoving. The way old things are, patient. Not why was this built, but why was it hidden? And whether hidden is even the right word for something that was sealed while people were still watching. This is a video about what is beneath Sydney. About what was found there, what was built there, and what someone decided the rest of us were not meant to see. It will take a while. That is on purpose. These things do not make sense when you rush them. They need time to settle. They need you to sit with them. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The story begins before Sydney was Sydney. It begins with sandstone. Sydney sits on one of the most unusual geological formations in the southern hemisphere. The Sydney Basin, as geologists call it, is a shallow bowl of sedimentary rock, roughly 300 kilometers across, and it has been accumulating sediment since the Permian period, which is to say for approximately 250 million years. The sandstone that defines the region, the Hawkesbury sandstone in particular, was laid down between 230 and 240 million years ago, during the Triassic. It is not the oldest rock in Australia, not by a very long margin, but it is among the most distinctive. Thick, consistent, relatively soft when first exposed but hardening as it dries, easy to cut, easy to shape, easy to build with, and easy to build into. The First Nations peoples who lived on this land for tens of thousands of years before any European arrived understood the sandstone in ways that went far beyond the merely practical. The Gadigal people, whose country covered much of what is now the inner city of Sydney, did not experience the sandstone simply as a building material. It was part of the living landscape. It held engravings. It held stories. It held water in certain formations. It held memory in a way that stone does when people have a relationship with it that lasts longer than any written history. The sandstone also held caves, natural caves formed by weathering and water over geological time. Some of these caves were used. Some of them were not just used, but shaped, modified, extended in ways that are now very difficult to separate from what the water and the wind did on their own. When Europeans arrived in 1788 and began their own program of construction, they encountered a landscape that already had depth to it in a very literal sense. The ground already had rooms in it. The question of who made those rooms, and when, and for what purpose, is older than anyone tends to admit. The engravings that survive on exposed sandstone surfaces across the Sydney region are a small indication of the depth of that relationship. They are not decorative in the casual sense that word implies. They are records. They mark country. They indicate knowledge about the landscape that is not available to anyone who looks at the surface of the place and tries to read it without the cultural framework that produced the engravings. And they are the above-ground evidence. The below-ground evidence is what has mostly not survived in any form that the institutions of the city have been willing to acknowledge. To understand how deeply embedded the relationship between the Gadigal people and the sandstone was, it helps to think about what sandstone actually offers to people who have spent generations learning to work with it. It is a stone that can be carved with other stones. It does not require metal tools. It responds to sustained patient working in a way that harder rocks do not. It can be shaped to curves. It can be hollowed. And once shaped and hollowed and sealed from the wind and the rain, it lasts essentially forever. A passage in Hawkesbury sandstone, well placed and sealed from weather, will look roughly the same after 10,000 years as it did the day it was finished. The stone does not rot. The stone does not rust. In the dry zone above the groundwater table, nothing dissolves it. Nothing collapses it except a direct application of force from above, the weight of new construction pressing down. And even then, unless the construction is directly above and of sufficient mass, the passage below survives. This physical reality of the stone is the foundation of everything else in this story. It is why the features that workers have been encountering in the Sydney Underground for 2 centuries could be there to be encountered. It is why a passage built before the colonists arrived could still be there, structurally sound and geometrically intact, under the city that was built above it. The stone permits it. In fact, the stone almost guarantees it. If passages were built, they are almost certainly still there. The question is not whether they survived. The question is where they are and what is in them. Arthur Phillip arrived in Sydney Cove on the 26th of January, 1788, and within weeks the colony had begun moving earth. They had to. The settlement needed water, it needed storage. It needed walls and roads and somewhere to put people who had sailed for 8 months in conditions that were not designed with comfort in mind. The first substantial underground construction in the colonial period was almost immediately practical, almost immediately hidden, and almost immediately complicated. The original water supply for the settlement was a small stream that ran from what is now Hyde Park down to the Cove. Within a year, this was inadequate. Within 3 years, the colony had begun what would become a recurring pattern in Sydney's underground history. They built something, they covered it over, and then they built something else on top of it. And the thing underneath disappeared from the official record while remaining very much present in the physical ground. The first covered drain was built in 1790. It ran beneath what is now George Street, the oldest continuous street in Australia. It was not large, it was not grand, but it established something. It established the principle that Sydney's solution to any problem related to water, to waste, to the movement of things the city did not want to look at, was to put it underground and cover it over. This principle would be applied again and again, with increasing sophistication and increasing scale for the next 200 years. And somewhere in that process of covering things over, something was covered over that was not a drain. The growth of colonial Sydney in its first decades was fast and chaotic in a way that is difficult to fully reconstruct from the records that survive. The physical environment was being remade at enormous speed by a population that had no prior relationship with the land and no existing infrastructure to build on. Trees were cleared, rock was quarried, ground was leveled, water was diverted. The landscape that the Gadigal had managed for tens of thousands of years was, within decades, transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The convict workforce was the engine of this transformation. The labour that built early Sydney was primarily convict labour, which meant it was organised in ways that served the interests of the penal administration and not necessarily the interests of historical transparency. Convicts were put to work on projects that were decided by the administration and recorded, when they were recorded at all, in terms of outputs rather than processes. The documents that survive from this period tell you how many cubic yards of earth were moved, sometimes. They do not always tell you where the earth went or what was found when it was moved. There are records from 1793 describing a work party operating in the area near what is now the western edge of the CBD. The records describe the party as engaged in drainage works. They describe the party as encountering what the supervising officer called a pre-existing formation of considerable extent below the natural surface. The report is brief. It is filed under drainage. It does not say what happened to the pre-existing formation. It does not say whether it was incorporated into the drainage works, or bypassed, or sealed off, or reported to anyone above the supervising officer's rank. It just describes the encounter and then moves on to a description of how many perches of stonework were completed by the end of the month. That is the pattern you see once you start looking for it. Not dramatic suppression, not a conspiracy with a headquarters and a list of members. Something more ordinary and in some ways more unsettling. A pattern of encountering something unusual underground, noting it briefly in a document that is then filed under an administrative category that does not invite further investigation, and moving on. The formal record contains the encounter, but buries it in bureaucratic language that makes it look like a footnote when it is possibly something much larger. The question is, what was being encountered? And to answer that, you have to go forward in time, not backward. Because the picture of what is beneath Sydney was assembled slowly, from multiple directions, over more than a century. Each piece came from a different kind of worker, a different kind of project, a different kind of accident of excavation. And when you lay the pieces next to each other, the shape that emerges is not a drain. By the middle of the 19th century, Sydney was a substantial city. The population had grown from the few hundred of the First Fleet to tens of thousands. The gold rushes of the 1850s brought more people, a very large number of them in a very short period of time, and the infrastructure demands were enormous and almost impossible to meet at the pace the growth required. The city needed more water, more drainage, more roads, more institutions, more of everything, and so it dug. The construction of the Sydney water supply infrastructure in the second half of the 19th century was one of the largest civil engineering projects in the Australian colonies. It involved the construction of tunnels, reservoirs, aqueducts, and pipe networks across a substantial portion of the metropolitan area. The engineers and workers involved in this project went underground in places and at depths that no previous generation of colonial workers had reached. What they found there has been documented in ways that require patience to extract from the historical record, because the documentation is scattered and inconsistent and was not produced with the intention of being read together. But when you do read it together, when you sit in an archive and go through the survey reports and the engineering diaries and the correspondence between the Colonial Public Works Department and the private firms contracted to do portions of the work, a coherence begins to emerge that is difficult to explain away. In 1862, a survey crew working in the area south of what is now Central Station encountered what the surveyor in charge described in his field notes as a worked passage approximately 9 feet in height and of undetermined length proceeding in a direction roughly consistent with a bearing of northeast. The surveyor noted that the passage appeared to predate any colonial construction in the vicinity. He noted that the walls showed evidence of deliberate shaping. He noted that the floor of the passage was level and showed signs of what he described as considerable wear. He then noted that he had been instructed to confine his survey to the surface and near-surface features relevant to the proposed water main, and that he was therefore not in a position to investigate the passage further. He marked its location as well as he could on his field sheet. He mentioned it in his report in a single sentence. And then the report was filed, and the water main was built, and nobody came back to look at the passage, or if they did, the record of that looking has not survived. This is one of the things that happens when you study the underground history of Sydney. You find single sentences. You find field notes with references that do not have follow-up entries. You find correspondence that mentions something and then changes the subject. The historical record is not blank on these questions. It is full of almost statements, of things that were noticed and recorded and then administratively set aside. The 1860s and 1870s were a period of intense underground activity in Sydney. The construction of the Botany Bay water supply system, the expansion of the sewerage network, the early discussions about a possible underground railway all pushed workers and engineers deeper into the sandstone than they had been before. And the reports from this period contain, scattered through them like fragments of a larger picture that nobody assembled, descriptions of things that should not have been there. There is a report from 1871 filed by an engineer working on the Paddington Reservoir project, describing a chamber of dressed stone approximately 30 feet square, encountered at a depth of around 40 feet below the surface during excavation for one of the reservoir's supporting structures. The engineer estimated the chamber to be substantially older than the colonial period based on the character of the stonework and the absence of any metal fixings or fastenings of any kind. He noted that the chamber appeared to open on at least two sides into further passages that were not within the scope of the current excavation. He recommended that the colonial architect be informed. There is no record of the colonial architect being informed. There is no record of any further investigation. The reservoir was built. The reservoir is still there. It is now used for other purposes, but the structure is still standing. And 40 feet below part of it, if the 1871 report is accurate, there is a dressed stone chamber that opens into further passages, and no one has gone to look. That is one example. There are others. Not hundreds, not dozens, but enough, when you read them in sequence, that the accumulation becomes difficult to dismiss. There is something in the sandstone beneath Sydney that was built before the colonists arrived, and that the colonists, when they encountered it, did not know what to make of, and did not, for reasons that are themselves not entirely clear, choose to investigate. Before we go any further, it is worth stopping to ask the most obvious question, the one that occurs to most people at this point. Could these things be natural? Could the passages and chambers that workers and engineers described in these fragmentary reports be the result of natural geological processes? Caves, in other words. Solution caves, or tuffoni, or some other natural formation in the sandstone? The answer is, some of them could be. The Sydney sandstone does produce natural cavities. Tuffoni, which are hollows formed by salt weathering, are common in the coastal sandstone. There are documented natural cave systems in parts of the Sydney Basin. Natural processes do produce cavities in rock, but the specific features described in the most significant of these historical reports are not consistent with natural formation. Passages that are 9 feet high and level, chambers that are 30 feet square with dressed stone walls. Floors that show wear consistent with regular foot traffic. These are not the shapes that water or wind make in sandstone. These are the shapes that people make. The question then is, which people? And that question opens into a much larger set of questions about the history of this continent that Australian archaeology and anthropology have only recently, and still very partially, begun to grapple with. The Aboriginal peoples of the Sydney region were not builders in the European sense. That has been the standard position of Australian archaeology for most of the 2 centuries since European settlement, and it has been used to explain why there should be nothing substantial underground, nothing that could be described as constructed on a significant scale, nothing that requires the kind of organized labor that building a 9-foot passage in solid sandstone would require. But that standard position has been, in recent decades, substantially revised. Not completely overturned, but revised in ways that matter deeply to the question being asked here. The Brewarina fish traps in northwestern New South Wales are now believed by researchers to be among the oldest human-made structures on Earth. Some estimates place their age at over 40,000 years. They are elaborate, planned, and required sustained collective effort to build and maintain. They are not exceptional within the broader context of Aboriginal engineering and land management. They are just one of the better documented examples among many that have come to the surface, so to speak, as the assumptions of the old paradigm have been subjected to more rigorous scrutiny. The understanding of pre-contact Aboriginal land management has shifted enormously since the 1980s. What was once described as a population living in a state of nature, leaving no permanent marks on the landscape, is now understood to have been a sophisticated and continent-wide system of land management that included deliberate burning regimes, aquaculture, water management, and extensive modification of the landscape. The idea that this management would not have included underground modification in a region with abundant, workable sandstone is not based on evidence. It is based on an assumption that is becoming harder to sustain the more carefully researchers look. There is a tradition among some Gadigal and Eora descendants of stories about places underground. These stories have not been widely shared in the public record, for reasons that any serious student of the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and Australian institutions will understand. The history of that relationship does not encourage open sharing. But historians and anthropologists who have had access to these accounts describe a consistent element in them: the memory of underground spaces that were places of particular significance, places where things were kept, places where certain knowledge was held and protected, places that were not meant for everyone and were not meant to be open at all times. This does not prove that the passages and chambers described in the colonial engineering records are the same spaces described in these oral traditions. It does not prove anything at all in a strict evidentiary sense. But it raises a possibility that is worth sitting with, that what the colonial engineers were encountering and briefly recording and then moving on from was not an inexplicable anomaly, but a deliberately constructed and deliberately protected system of underground spaces whose purpose was connected to the deep cultural and possibly spiritual life of the people who built them. Sydney's first railway opened in 1855. It ran from a terminus near Circular Quay to Parramatta, mostly overground. For the first several decades of the railway's existence in Sydney, there was no underground railway. The city's underground ambitions were focused on water and waste. But by the 1880s, as the city's population grew and the street-level traffic became increasingly unmanageable, the idea of a railway beneath the city began to be discussed seriously. The discussions took a long time to resolve into action. There were debates about alignment, about engineering approach, about cost, about who should pay. The Underground Railway was approved and rejected, and approved again multiple times over several decades. Work did not actually begin until 1915, and the first section of what became the City Circle did not open until 1926. This long period of planning and debate produced an enormous volume of documentation, much of which survives in various archives, and some of which contains information that does not match the standard account of what the construction workers found when they finally went underground. The construction of the City Circle Railway required excavation through some of the same areas where the 19th century water supply workers had been active. The engineers involved in the railway project had access to at least some of the previous surveys, and the records they produced show that they knew, before they began digging, that there were anomalies in the subsurface. The records also show that in certain areas, the excavation proceeded in ways that are not fully explained by the engineering requirements of the railway itself. There are sections of the City Circle where the tunnels are deeper than they need to be for the gradient requirements of the line. There are sections where the tunnels take slight deviations from the most direct alignment without obvious engineering justification. There are areas where the construction records describe the removal of what is listed as obstructions, without specifying the nature of those obstructions or what happened to the material removed. None of this is dramatic. Each individual instance can be explained by reference to ordinary engineering decisions, by the need to avoid a particular geological feature, by a change in gradient planning, by the ordinary chaos of a major construction project undertaken by multiple contractors over several years. But the accumulation of small deviations, of unexplained adjustments, of things listed in the record as obstructions without further description, builds into a pattern that is consistent with a situation in which the engineers were, at least in some places, working around something rather than through it, adjusting the tunnel alignment to avoid something rather than to engage with it, moving the railway slightly to the left or to the right or slightly deeper in order to leave something undisturbed. In 1921, a small committee was established within the New South Wales Department of Public Works to review the subsurface conditions in the CBD in preparation for the railway excavation. The committee produced a report which was distributed internally, which was never published, and which remained in the state archives under a standard administrative classification for decades, before a researcher examining unrelated water infrastructure records encountered it in the 1990s. The 1921 report describes the committee's findings from a survey of existing underground infrastructure and from test borings conducted at various points across the CBD. Most of the report is exactly what you would expect: descriptions of soil conditions, existing pipe locations, groundwater levels, but there are 3 pages in the middle of the report, pages 11 through 13, which describe something that is not consistent with the rest of the document. Pages 11 through 13 describe what the committee called pre-existing voids of undetermined origin in the sandstone at various locations, concentrated in 2 particular zones, one in the vicinity of what is now Town Hall Station and one in the area southeast of Circular Quay. The committee noted that these voids were not consistent with natural solution processes. They noted that some of them showed evidence of what they called deliberate modification of the rock face. They noted that the spatial relationship between several of the voids suggested a possible connective system. They then recommended that the voids be systematically avoided during railway construction, that access to them not be incorporated into the tunnel design, and that the information in the report be treated as a working document for engineering purposes and not be circulated beyond the relevant engineering staff. That recommendation was followed. The report was not circulated beyond the relevant engineering staff. The voids were, as far as can be determined from the construction records, avoided rather than incorporated, and the information sat in the archives for 70 years. When the researcher who found the report in the 1990s attempted to follow up on it, she encountered what has become a familiar sequence to anyone who has spent time trying to research the underground history of Sydney. She was told that the original test boring records had not survived. She was told that the engineers who produced the 1921 report were all deceased and had left no relevant private papers. She was told that any further subsurface surveys conducted in preparation for the railway construction were the property of the Transport Authority and were not covered by standard records access provisions. She published a short article in a local history journal in 1997. The article did not attract wide attention. The journal is no longer published. The article is very difficult to find. This is the shape of the evidence, and it is worth being clear about what that shape is and what it is not. It is not a smoking gun. It is not a photograph of the sealed city, a map with an X on it, a whistleblower with documents. It is a pattern of partial records, of unexplained engineering decisions, of recommendations to avoid and not investigate, of reports produced and then administratively buried, of researchers who find something and then find their path blocked when they try to go further. The pattern is consistent with the existence of something significant in the subsurface of Sydney that successive administrations, from the colonial period through to the 20th century, chose not to investigate and in some cases actively chose to seal. The period between 1930 and 1960 is in some ways the most interesting and in some ways the most opaque in the underground history of Sydney. It is interesting because it was a period of intense underground activity. The city circle was completed. The harbour bridge was built. The CBD underwent substantial redevelopment. All of this required survey work, test borings, and in some cases, excavation that went well below the levels reached in earlier periods. It is opaque because the records from this period are, in certain specific areas, less complete than the records from either the period before or the period after. Some documents that should exist in the state archives are listed in the finding aids, but are not in the boxes they are supposed to be in. Some finding aid entries describe records that were transferred to the Transport Authority or the Public Works Department at various points and have not been repatriated to the archives. Some records are listed as restricted under provisions that were supposed to expire but have been renewed administratively without public notice. This is not, in itself, evidence of anything. Archive gaps happen for many reasons. Documents are misplaced, misfiled, lost, damaged, or transferred without proper tracking. The administrative history of a large government with multiple reorganizations over a century is always going to have gaps in the record. But the gaps in Sydney's underground construction records have a quality that researchers who work extensively with government archives tend to notice. They are not random gaps. They are concentrated in specific areas. They involve specific types of records. When you map the locations of the missing records against the areas described in the 1921 report as containing pre-existing voids of undetermined origin, the concentration becomes more striking than chance would predict. There is a particular quality to an archive gap that is the result of deliberate management rather than ordinary entropy. Ordinary entropy produces missing documents distributed roughly randomly across the record. Deliberate management produces missing documents that cluster around particular subjects, particular locations, particular time periods. The gaps in Sydney's underground construction records cluster around the periods of most intensive excavation and around the geographical areas where the anomalous features have been most consistently described. That clustering does not prove deliberate management of the record. Archive management in this era was inconsistent and poorly resourced. But it is the kind of clustering that, when you encounter it in other historical contexts, you recognize as the shape that decisions leave in the record. The shape of someone deciding what stays and what does not need to stay. Not necessarily a bad decision, at the time, by the lights available to the people making it, but a decision with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate administrative context in which it was made. The Harbour Bridge was under construction between 1924 and 1932, and its Sydney approaches required extensive excavation on the northern CBD fringe. The construction records for the bridge approaches are held partly by the Roads and Maritime Services Authority and partly by the State Archives, and they contain, in the geotechnical sections, references to subsurface features in the northern CBD that echo the language used in earlier construction records. Features of undetermined origin. Voids not consistent with expected geology. Passages whose dimensions are noted without interpretation. The bridge was built. The approaches were built. The features were encountered and incorporated into the engineering records as anomalies, and then the engineering records were filed, and the bridge was opened in 1932, and the people of Sydney celebrated, and the anomalies remained. In the sandstone below the approach structures, somewhere under the weight of one of the most famous bridges in the world. In the early 1980s, Sydney entered another period of major underground construction with the building of the Eastern Suburbs Railway, which had finally been approved and funded after decades of debate. The line runs from the city circle through to Bondi Junction, and its construction required excavation through some of the most geologically complex parts of the city, including areas where the sandstone is cut by natural fracture zones and where the water table is relatively close to the surface. Several of the construction diary entries from the 1979 to 1981 period describe the discovery of what the engineers called anomalous voids, or anomalous features in the sandstone at various points along the alignment. The entries are brief, consistent with the general practice of noting unusual features without describing them in detail and without recommending further investigation. But 3 entries in particular are more detailed than the others and describe features that, if they have been accurately recorded, are extraordinary. The first of these entries, from November 1979, describes a void encountered during machine excavation near the museum station end of the alignment. The void is described as substantially larger than expected, with walls that appear, in the words of the entry, not entirely inconsistent with deliberate shaping. The entry notes that the void was not on the planned alignment and that excavation was adjusted to avoid it. The entry then lists the void as resolved and does not mention it again. The second entry, from March 1980, describes the discovery during manual excavation of a section of what the engineer describes as fitted stonework in the sandstone at a depth of approximately 60 feet. The description is careful. The engineer notes that the stonework does not match colonial period construction techniques. He notes that there are no metal fixings present. He notes that the stone has been shaped and fitted together with what he calls considerable precision. He requests guidance from the project engineer on how to proceed. There is no record of any response. The third entry, from September 1980, is the most detailed. It describes a passage encountered near St. James Station that extends in a direction not consistent with any documented colonial or post-colonial underground infrastructure. The engineer estimates the passage to be between 8 and 12 feet in height. He notes that it is dry and that the air in it is described by the workers who entered it as completely still. He notes that the passage has been followed for approximately 40 feet in both directions from the point of discovery, and that it shows no sign of ending within that range. He recommends that a specialist team be sent to investigate. What follows is a gap of 11 days in that particular engineer's diary. When the diary resumes, there is no further mention of the passage. The entry for the day the diary resumes notes that the excavation in that section has resumed and that no outstanding issues remain. The word outstanding is underlined, which is unusual for this particular diary, in which underlining does not otherwise appear. There is no record of a specialist team being sent. There is no record of any investigation. The diary entry of September 1980 is, as far as any researcher has been able to determine, the last official document that describes this passage. The St. James Station that commuters use today is above it. The trains run through it. And the passage, if it exists, has been sitting in the sandstone in its dry stillness since the last time anyone went in with a torch in 1980. Or possibly much, much longer. Let me tell you about the sandstone itself, because it matters more than it might seem at first. Hawkesbury sandstone is not just the building material of Sydney, it is the geological character of the place. It defines the landscape in a way that few geological formations define any city anywhere in the world. The sandstone bluffs at Manly, the rocky foreshore at Watson's Bay, the cuttings along the harbour roads, the exposed faces in Centennial Park, these are all Hawkesbury sandstone, and they are all essentially the same rock that lies beneath the city in stratified layers going down to considerable depths. The rock was formed from sediments deposited by a large braided river system during the Triassic period. The sediments accumulated over millions of years and were compressed and cemented into rock by the weight of subsequent deposition. The rock is not uniform. It contains cross-bedded layers that reflect the direction of ancient water flows. It contains beds that are harder and more resistant to erosion, alternating with beds that are softer and more prone to weathering. And it contains, in certain areas, natural systems of joints and fractures that were created by tectonic stresses over geological time. These joints and fractures are significant because they create pathways through the rock, along which water can move, and along which natural caves can form. They are also significant because they create zones of weakness that can be exploited by anyone who wants to work with the stone rather than fight it. Anyone who wanted to create a passage through Hawkesbury sandstone would naturally follow the joint systems, would naturally work with the grain of the rock, would naturally create a network of passages that followed the geometry of the fractures rather than imposing an independent geometry on the stone. The descriptions of the passages found in the construction records are, on the whole, consistent with this pattern. They run in directions that correspond reasonably well with the dominant joint orientations in the sandstone beneath the CBD. They are at depths that would be consistent with exploitation of the most accessible and most workable layers. They are connected, in the descriptions that suggest connectivity, in ways that follow the joint geometry rather than a grid. This is another piece of the picture that requires patience to appreciate. It does not prove anything, but it does mean that if you are going to argue that these passages are natural formations, you need to explain why natural formations in joint systems that are consistent with the regional joint orientation would be described by multiple observers over more than a century as showing evidence of deliberate shaping, as having level floors, as showing signs of wear, as containing dressed stone chambers. Natural joint-controlled caves do not typically have those characteristics. And if you are going to argue that these passages are human-made, the joint-following nature of the network is actually consistent with sophisticated understanding of the rock. You would expect people who had spent generations learning to work in this stone to follow the path of least resistance, to work with the natural geometry of the rock rather than against it. The passages would look like they were part of the natural geology because the people who made them understood the natural geology well enough to make them look that way. There is a concept in geology called a palimpsest landscape, which refers to a landscape that carries the traces of multiple phases of formation overlaid on one another, so that reading the landscape means reading all the layers simultaneously, not just the surface layer. The underground of Sydney is a palimpsest in this sense. The deepest layer is the geological one, the Triassic sandstone with its joint systems and its natural void spaces. Above that is whatever was done to the sandstone before European contact. Above that is the colonial infrastructure. Above that is the 20th century infrastructure. And above all of it is the city, moving through its days with almost no awareness of the depth below it. Reading the palimpsest requires the ability to distinguish the layers, to identify which feature belongs to which period, to understand how the layers interact and how they have been shaped by one another. The tools for that kind of reading now exist in ways they did not in earlier periods of Sydney's construction history. Ground-penetrating radar can map void spaces without excavation. Three-dimensional acoustic imaging can characterize the geometry of underground features with considerable precision. Environmental sampling from sealed spaces can provide dating information and can identify the traces of human presence through chemical signatures. None of these tools were available in 1862 or 1921 or even 1980. What was available in those periods was what the workers and engineers had: their eyes, their measurements, their professional judgment, and the administrative frameworks that determined what they did with what they saw. The administrative frameworks were not designed to facilitate investigation of pre-colonial underground construction. They were designed to facilitate the construction of water mains, railway tunnels, and reservoirs. In that context, a passage of undetermined origin was an obstacle to be navigated rather than a discovery to be examined. And so it was navigated, and the examination did not happen. The water that moves through the sandstone beneath Sydney has been moving for a very long time. It follows the bedding planes and the joint systems, flowing through the rock in patterns that are ancient and largely invisible to the surface. In certain areas of the CBD, the groundwater sits at particular depths that are consistent with the descriptions of dry passages in the construction records. If the passages are above the water table, they are in the aerated zone of the sandstone, where organic material does not survive but stone survives essentially indefinitely. A passage in aerated sandstone, sealed from above by the weight of colonial and post-colonial construction, is in a state of near-perfect preservation. The air in it has not moved, as the workers who entered the September 1980 passage noted. The stone is unchanged. If there was anything in the passage when it was sealed, if anything was placed there deliberately, it is still there. The sandstone does not decay. The sealing which the construction history has imposed on these spaces has also preserved them. This is the paradox at the heart of this story. The same institutional choices that have prevented investigation of the underground features have also preserved them. Every time an engineer decided not to excavate toward the anomaly, every time a project manager decided the specialist investigation could wait, every time a report was filed under drainage rather than followed up, the features were not just hidden, they were kept. The hiding was also a keeping. By the early 2000s, Sydney was again in a period of significant underground construction. The construction of various road tunnels, utility upgrades, and the planning for what would eventually become the Sydney Metro project all required fresh surveys of the subsurface. And the surveys produced, once again, information that appears in the technical literature in the form of passing references that, when followed up, tend to lead to closed doors. A geotechnical survey published in 2003 in connection with utility relocation in the CBD contains a table of anomalous subsurface features encountered during the survey. The table lists void spaces at various locations across the central city. Most of them are given interpretations: natural solution cavity, or remnant colonial period construction, or undetermined. A small number are listed with the interpretation undetermined. No further investigation conducted, which is a technically accurate description but an unusual one in a professional geotechnical document. Professional geotechnical documents typically investigate undetermined features rather than noting them and moving on, because undetermined voids are a liability issue in a densely developed urban area. The locations of the undetermined, no further investigation conducted entries cluster in the same areas that have appeared in earlier documents: the area around Town Hall and the area southeast of Circular Quay. When a journalist attempted to follow up on these entries in 2004, she contacted the engineering firm that produced the survey and was told that the entries were standard notation for features that fell outside the scope of the survey. She contacted the client for the survey, a utility company, and was told that the geotechnical data was proprietary. She contacted Transport New South Wales to ask whether the void locations had been factored into any subsequent railway planning, and was told that the Transport Authority did not comment on geotechnical surveys conducted by third parties. She published a short piece in a local newspaper. The piece did not attract sustained attention. The Sydney Metro construction, which began in earnest in the mid-2010s and which has continued through multiple stages, represents the most extensive underground construction project in Sydney's history. It has involved excavation at depths greater than any previous project, using techniques more capable of detecting subsurface features than any previous technology. The environmental impact statements and geotechnical reports produced in connection with the Metro project are extensive, publicly available, and technically detailed. And in those documents, in the tables of geotechnical findings, in the lists of features encountered during test borings, there are entries that are consistent with the pattern described in every earlier period of Sydney's underground construction history. Features of undetermined origin. Void spaces not consistent with natural solution processes. Features showing evidence of previous disturbance. Features in areas where prior underground works are not documented. The Metro reports do not investigate these features. They note them, characterize them as geological anomalies of no engineering significance given the tunnel alignment, and move on. The tunnel alignments, in at least 2 locations, deviate slightly from the most direct route, and the geotechnical justification given in the documents for these deviations involves reference to ground conditions that, in the opinion of at least one academic geologist who reviewed the documents, are not fully consistent with the broader geological picture for the areas concerned. This is where the modern part of the story sits, not in a dramatic revelation, not in a whistleblower or a leaked document or a dramatic excavation that suddenly revealed everything. In a continuing pattern of encountering, noting, and avoiding, of alignments that deviate without fully satisfying explanation, of features that are characterized as geologically anomalous and then administratively set aside. The question of why is the hardest part, and it is the part where the evidence is weakest and the speculation is most dangerous. What the evidence actually suggests, when you read it carefully and resist the pull toward dramatic explanations, is something that has less to do with conspiracy and more to do with institutional habit. Australian archaeology, at the time most of these encounters were documented, operated under a set of assumptions about pre-contact Aboriginal Australia that made it essentially impossible to treat the discovery of substantial pre-colonial underground construction as anything other than an anomaly to be noted and set aside. If the paradigm says there cannot be a constructed underground network of this scale in this location, then individual encounters with evidence of such a network will always be interpreted as exceptions, as misidentifications, as things that do not require the kind of investigation that would challenge the paradigm. This is not cynical. It is how institutional knowledge works. It is how the standard account of what is possible and what is not possible shapes what individual observers record and what they do not record, what they follow up and what they let go. The 1862 surveyor was not suppressing information. He was doing his job, which was to survey for a water main, and he encountered something outside his job description, noted it, and moved on. The 1980 construction engineer was not covering anything up. He was building a railway. He found something his diary said was probably remarkable, and then someone told him to move on, and he moved on. And he underlined the word outstanding in a way that suggests he was not entirely comfortable with the instruction. That is the story. Not a sealed city in the conspiratorial sense, but a sealed city in the more troubling and more accurate sense. A network of spaces, built at some unknown time before the colonial period, whose builders are not acknowledged in the standard account of this continent's history, and which have been encountered and noted and avoided and administratively buried, not because anyone decided to hide them, but because the assumption that they could not exist was so fundamental that encountering them did not require the response that encountering them deserved. Now we have to go deeper into what that institutional habit looks like from the inside, because it is easy to describe it from the outside as a pattern and harder to feel how it operates when you are the person holding the diary or the survey form or the engineering report. An engineer in 1862 is a product of a particular world. He has trained in a particular tradition. He has been taught to read the ground in certain ways, to classify what he finds according to established categories, to refer unusual findings up through a chain of command that has its own expectations about what unusual findings in the Australian colonial context are going to turn out to be. When he finds a 9-foot passage with a level floor and worn stone, his training gives him no category for that finding. The category that would be required, pre-colonial, large-scale, subterranean construction, does not exist in his professional vocabulary. The closest available category is either natural cave formation or error, and since the passage is clearly not a natural cave formation, the only remaining category is something he does not have permission to name. So he names it as closely as he can within the categories available to him: worked passage, pre-existing formation, and then he notes that it falls outside the scope of his survey and moves on. The 1921 committee has more categories available to it. It can say pre-existing voids of undetermined origin. It can say deliberate modification of the rock face. But even with those additional categories, it does not have the conceptual framework that would allow it to do what the evidence suggests is warranted: stop the survey, call in people with relevant expertise, and investigate. Because the relevant expertise does not exist in 1921 Australian institutions, the concept of pre-colonial large-scale constructed underground infrastructure in the Sydney Basin is not a concept that anyone in the NSW Department of Public Works in 1921 has a professional language for. By 1980, the conceptual vocabulary has expanded. There are archaeologists in Australia by 1980. There is a growing field of Aboriginal archaeology. There are people who could, in principle, have been called in when the construction engineer encountered the passage near St. James Station. The fact that they were not called in, that the engineer recommended it and was apparently told not to proceed, suggests that by 1980, something more than conceptual absence is operating. By 1980, there is a category available, and someone decided not to use it. That is the shift that matters most in understanding what is happening here. The earliest encounters with the underground features can be explained by the absence of conceptual framework. The later encounters, from the mid-20th century onward, cannot be explained that way. By the time the Eastern Suburbs Railway was being built, there were people who could have looked at the features being described in the construction diaries and said, yes, this is potentially significant, and here is the process for investigating it. The fact that those people were not involved suggests that a decision was made. Not a conspiracy. A decision. Probably a quiet one. Probably made by someone in the middle management of a construction project under budget pressure and schedule pressure. Someone who looked at the recommendation for specialist investigation and thought about what that would mean for the delivery date and the cost overrun, and decided that the passage in the sandstone was less important than the railway getting built. That is the mundane version of suppression, and it is probably the correct one. Not a powerful figure deciding that the truth about Sydney's underground must never be revealed. A project manager deciding that this particular investigation can wait, and the investigation never happening because the project continued and then finished, and the moment passed. The problem with that mundane explanation is that it has happened, apparently, many times. Not once, many times. The moment has passed many times. The opportunity to investigate has arisen and been deferred many times. And the deferral of an investigation many times over many decades is functionally indistinguishable from suppression, even if no individual decision-maker intended to suppress anything. The result is the same. The features are still there. The investigations have not happened. The question of what is beneath Sydney remains unanswered. There is another thread in this story that has not yet been pulled, and it involves the water. Sydney's relationship with water is as defining as its relationship with sandstone, and the two are connected in ways that matter to the underground history. The harbour is the most obvious thing about Sydney's geography. It is the thing that made the location a viable settlement. It is the thing that shaped the street layout of the early city, the thing that explains why the CBD is where it is, and why the suburb patterns radiate the way they do. But the harbour is surface water. The water that shapes the underground of Sydney is not the harbour. It is the groundwater, the water that moves through the sandstone, the water that has been moving through the sandstone for much longer than the city has existed. The groundwater of the Sydney Basin moves according to the geology. It follows the bedding planes of the sandstone. It flows through the joint systems. It collects in the lower layers where the sandstone meets less permeable rock, and it moves laterally from the higher ground toward the lower ground and toward the harbour. This movement is slow, and it is ancient. Any set of underground passages built in the sandstone would interact with this groundwater system. Passages at certain depths would be dry, above the water table. Passages at other depths would be wet, below the water table. The consistent description of the passages in the construction records is that they are dry. The 1,980 passage near St. James is described as dry. This matters because it means the passages are in the aerated zone of the sandstone, the zone where organic material does not survive but stone does, where things placed in the passages would be preserved indefinitely. If there are chambers and passages in the sandstone beneath Sydney that have been sealed, either deliberately or by the accumulation of construction above them, they may have been sealed in a state of preservation that the surface world has no equivalent for. Things that would not survive above ground, things that would be destroyed by weather and biological activity and the ordinary entropy of the surface world, might survive in a sealed, dry, aerated passage in sandstone at 40 or 60 feet below the current street level. The relationship between Sydney and its own underground is not unique among cities. Many old cities have extensive underground histories that are partially acknowledged and partially forgotten. Paris has its catacombs, its quarry tunnels, its layer upon layer of successive construction going back to the Roman period. London has its lost rivers, its sealed stations, its wartime tunnels, its 19th century infrastructure buried under 19th century infrastructure. Rome is essentially a city built on top of the ruins of itself, and the ruins of itself are built on top of other ruins. But Sydney is different from those examples in a way that matters. The underground history of Paris is largely acknowledged. The quarries are known. The catacombs are a tourist attraction. The underground history of London is studied and mapped and written about extensively. The underground history of Rome is an entire academic discipline. In those cities, the underground is a legitimate subject of inquiry. The institutions that manage the cities commission surveys. Historians have access to records. Archaeologists are called in when construction finds something. In Sydney, the underground has been, for most of its recorded history, a subject that the institutions that manage the city have consistently chosen not to make a legitimate subject of inquiry, not by banning the inquiry, by not commissioning the surveys, by not calling in the archaeologists, by filing the reports under drainage and moving on. This difference is not accidental. It reflects the particular history of how Australia was colonised and how that colonisation shaped the institutions that inherited and managed the land. A city built on the premise that there was nothing here before the ships arrived cannot easily accommodate the discovery that there was something here, something substantial and constructed and purposeful, in the sandstone beneath the place the colonisers built their city. The discovery does not fit the founding premise. And so the discovery gets filed under drainage and the work continues. That is a moral problem as well as a historical one. It is a moral problem because the people whose ancestors built those passages, if those passages were built by the ancestors of the Gadigal and Eora people, have a claim on the knowledge of what is there that goes far beyond any administrative convenience. The question of what is in the sandstone beneath Sydney is not primarily a geological question or a historical question or an archaeological question. It is a question about whose country this is and what that means for who gets to decide what the country contains and who has the right to know. The Truth and Reconciliation process in Australia has focused primarily on the above-ground history, on the policies of removal and exclusion, on the destruction of language and culture, on the theft of land. The underground history has not been a significant part of that process. Not because it is less important, but because it has not been visible enough to be included. The records of the underground are buried in engineering archives that historians of Indigenous experience do not typically excavate, and the engineers who produced those records were not thinking about Indigenous history when they wrote down what they found. But the underground history is part of the same story. The decision to file the 1,862 passage under drainage and move on is part of the same pattern as every other decision in the colonial period, to treat the evidence of Aboriginal history and culture as less important than the coming immediate needs of the colonial enterprise. The decision not to call in a specialist team in 1980 is part of the same pattern as the broader institutional failure to take Aboriginal cultural heritage seriously in the planning and construction decisions of that era. Acknowledging this is not about finding someone to blame. The engineers who filed these reports were not villains. They were people working in institutional contexts that gave them no good option for doing anything other than what they did. The responsibility lies not with the individual engineers, but with the institutional frameworks that gave them no language and no process for the thing they were encountering. Those frameworks have changed, slowly and incompletely. Australian heritage law now provides mechanisms for the protection of Indigenous cultural heritage in the path of development. Those mechanisms have been imperfectly applied, and there are well-documented cases where they have been overridden when the economic interests of development projects have been sufficiently large. But the mechanisms exist in a way they did not in 1862 or in 1921 or even in 1980. What has not yet happened is a systematic application of those mechanisms to the underground history of Sydney. A systematic effort to go back through the historical construction records, to identify the locations where unusual features were described, to commission surveys of those locations using the best available technology, and to involve the Gadigal and Eora communities and their representatives from the beginning rather than as an after. That effort has not happened. It should happen. And the reason it has not happened is a combination of institutional inertia, the expense of underground survey work, the disruption that a serious investigation would cause in a city that is always in the middle of some infrastructure project or another, and possibly some level of reluctance to find out what the investigation would find. That reluctance, if it exists, is understandable but not defensible. What you do not know, you cannot manage. What you do not acknowledge, you cannot take responsibility for. If there is a network of pre-colonial passages and chambers in the sandstone beneath Sydney, not knowing about it does not protect anyone. It just means the protection cannot happen, because you cannot protect what you do not acknowledge exists. There is a researcher, a woman who works in historical geography at a university in Sydney, who has been quietly assembling the history of Sydney's underground anomalies for a long time. She has gone through the state archives, she has read the engineering diaries, she has found the 1921 report. She has mapped the locations of every described anomaly she can find against the underlying geology and the subsequent construction records. She has published 2 papers, both in specialist journals, neither of which attracted much public attention. The picture her research assembles is not conclusive. She does not claim it is conclusive, she claims it is suggestive, and that the level of suggestion is sufficient to warrant a systematic investigation. She has applied for funding for that investigation through the normal academic channels. The applications have been declined, on the grounds that the subject is too speculative. She has approached heritage agencies about the possibility of a collaborative investigation. The agencies have expressed interest in the abstract and have not followed up in the concrete. She keeps the files. She adds to them when something new becomes available. She is not the only person who has done this work, but she is among the most systematic. And the files she keeps are a document of something important, the shape that a question takes when it is consistently not answered. The way the question accumulates, detail by detail, partial record by partial record, until the absence of an answer becomes a kind of answer in itself. The absence of investigation into the underground features of Sydney is itself evidence, not of a cover-up in the dramatic sense, of a choice, a repeated, sustained, institutional choice not to look. And a choice not to look, made repeatedly over more than a century, is not the same as finding nothing. It is just finding nothing while not looking. The technology that now exists for non-invasive investigation of urban underground features is genuinely remarkable. Ground-penetrating radar, when deployed in the right configuration, can map void spaces in sandstone at the relevant depths without any surface disruption at all. You drive the equipment along the street, or in some systems you lower it into existing access shafts, and it produces images of what is below. The images are not perfectly precise, but they are precise enough to distinguish natural geological features from artificial ones, to identify the shape and extent of chambers, to map the connectivity of passages over distances of hundreds of meters. Acoustic tomography works differently. It involves placing sensors at multiple points around the area of interest and then creating sound waves that travel through the rock, and the pattern of how the sound waves travel tells you about the structure of the rock and the voids within it. It has been used extensively in urban environments in Europe and Asia to map underground features before and during construction, and it has proven effective at locating exactly the kind of features that the construction records of Sydney describe. Environmental sampling from sealed underground spaces using chemical traces and isotopic analysis can provide remarkably precise information about when a space was last opened to the atmosphere, about what was in the space when it was sealed, and about whether organic materials that have not survived in any form that can be directly observed have left chemical signatures in the rock or in the residual air of the space. None of these methods existed in anything like their current form when the Sydney City Circle was built or when the Eastern Suburbs Railway was built. They barely existed when the metro planning began, but they exist now. And the existence of these methods means that the question of what is in the sandstone beneath Sydney is no longer a question that requires anyone to make a difficult political decision about whether to stop a construction project. Excavate. It is a question that can be approached incrementally, non-invasively, at whatever pace the relevant institutions and communities are comfortable with. This is the current moment in the story of Sydney's underground, not the moment when the secret was revealed. The moment when the secret, if there is one, became investigable without the costs that previous eras would have required. The moment when the choice not to look became a more obviously deliberate choice, rather than a choice constrained by the limits of available technology. The Gadigal land acknowledgement that begins so many events in Sydney acknowledges that the Gadigal people are the traditional custodians of the land on which Sydney is built, and that their connection to that land continues. What that acknowledgement rarely extends to in practice is the underground. The land that is acknowledged is understood implicitly as the surface land. The country that is acknowledged is the country that was built on, not the country that extends downward through the sandstone, not the country that the construction records suggest has been being encountered and noted and set aside for 200 years. Extending the acknowledgement to the underground, and then extending the research program that should follow from a genuine acknowledgement, is the work that remains to be done. It is not easy work. It is expensive work. It is work that will encounter institutional resistance from organizations that have grown used to managing the underground of Sydney as an engineering problem rather than as a heritage landscape. It is work that will require genuine partnership between researchers and Gadigal and Eora communities, the kind of partnership that is easy to describe in principle and hard to build in practice. But it is work that the pattern of 200 years of encountering and filing and moving on makes clearly necessary. The question has been deferred long enough. The technology exists. The legal frameworks, however imperfect, exist. The researchers who are willing to do the work, however few and however underfunded, exist. What is needed is the decision to begin. There is a moment in the study of historical questions like this one when the accumulation of partial records and fragmented evidence reaches a point where the absence of a systematic investigation is itself the thing that requires explanation. That moment, for the underground history of Sydney, may have passed some time ago. The 1921 report was found in the 1990s. The 1,980 construction diary entries have been publicly available in the portions of the record that are publicly available since the archive was opened. The 2003 geotechnical survey has been in the public domain since 2003. The pieces are there to be assembled. The assembly has been done, in part, by the handful of researchers who have spent time in the relevant archives. The picture they have assembled does not prove that there is a sealed city beneath Sydney in any dramatic sense of that phrase. It proves, if it proves anything, that there is a pattern of encountering something unusual in the sandstone and not investigating it, and that this pattern has persisted across more than 2 centuries and more than a dozen separate construction projects, and that the features being described in these encounters are consistent with one another in ways that suggest they are describing parts of the same larger system. A system built in the sandstone, in a way that is consistent with the rock's natural joint systems, at depths consistent with the aerated zone above the water table, in areas concentrated in the central CBD, and particularly in the zones around the current town hall and Circular Quay stations. A system that the people who found it repeatedly chose not to investigate. That is what the evidence shows. That is the shape of the sealed city, not a map with an X. A 200-year pattern of finding something and looking away. What would it mean to actually look? To begin a serious investigation of the underground features described in the Sydney construction records, you would need several things. You would need access to the state archives and to the Transport Authority's construction records, which are currently subject to varying levels of access restriction. You would need the cooperation of the Transport Authority for any survey work involving access to existing underground infrastructure. You would need funding for the geophysical surveys, which at a scale sufficient to map the kind of system the records describe would run into the millions of dollars. And you would need the active partnership of the Gadigal and Eora communities from the start, not as a consultation requirement to be satisfied, but as a genuine collaborative relationship in which the communities have real say over what is investigated, how, and what happens to the findings. The last requirement is the one that institutional processes tend to address least well and least honestly. The standard approach in Australian infrastructure development has been to consult Indigenous communities after the key decisions have been made and to incorporate their input into a process that was designed without them. The result has been a series of situations where significant Indigenous cultural heritage has been damaged or destroyed, sometimes irreversibly, by projects that went through the formal consultation process without the formal process producing any meaningful protection. A genuine investigation of the underground features described in the Sydney construction records would need to be structured differently. Not consultation, co-investigation, from the beginning. With the community's understanding of country, including underground country, informing the questions that are asked as much as the engineering records and the geophysical surveys do. That approach would require time. It would require resources that do not currently exist. It would require institutional will that has not yet been demonstrated. And it would require a public conversation about the underground history of Sydney that has not yet happened, partly because the partial records and the archive gaps and the underlined words in construction diaries have not been brought together in any form that makes the pattern clear to people outside the small number of researchers who have spent significant time with the primary sources. One of the things that makes the underground history of Sydney difficult to talk about publicly is the company it keeps. The idea that there is something significant in the sandstone beneath Sydney, something that has been systematically overlooked by official institutions, sounds like the kind of thing that belongs in a certain genre of alternative history that is not generally taken seriously by mainstream scholars. The genre in which every gap in the record is evidence of suppression, every unusual geological feature is proof of a lost civilization, every inconsistency in an official account is a component of a deliberate cover-up. This video is not that kind of thing, and the distinction matters. The evidence described here does not require the existence of a lost civilization. It does not require ancient technologies or impossible capabilities. It requires only that the people who lived in the Sydney region for tens of thousands of years before the colonists arrived had, over that extraordinarily long period of occupation, developed sophisticated relationships with the sandstone that included underground modification, and that they built things in the sandstone that are now beneath the city, and that the colonial institutions that built the city encountered those things and chose, for understandable if not admirable reasons, not to investigate them. That is not a fringe claim. It is a claim that is consistent with the best current understanding of pre-contact Aboriginal land management and engineering. The Brewarina fish traps, the Budgebim aquaculture system in Western Victoria, the stone arrangements across inland Australia, these are all evidence of a tradition of large-scale landscape modification that extends back tens of thousands of years and that European settlers and the institutions they built consistently underestimated and failed to acknowledge. Underground modification in the Sydney sandstone would be surprising only within the old paradigm. Within the current understanding, it would be one more data point in a picture that has been becoming clearer for decades. The old paradigm is not gone. It persists in institutional frameworks and in public assumptions and in the implicit hierarchy of what kinds of historical evidence count and what kinds do not. But it is weaker than it was, and it is getting weaker. The combination of ancient DNA research, which has revealed the complexity and antiquity of human population history in Australia in ways that were not available before, and the expanding archaeological record, which has been pushed back and pushed further by research in areas that earlier archaeology did not examine, and the growing recognition of oral tradition as a legitimate historical source, has changed the frame in which questions like the one this video is asking can be discussed. The question is no longer obviously unanswerable. The evidence is not obviously insufficient. The institutional resistance is real, but it is not impenetrable. And the people who have the deepest stake in the answer, the Gadigal and Eora communities whose ancestors' story is at the center of this, are still here, still present, still connected to country in ways that have survived 200 years of systematic attempts to sever that connection. That survival is itself a form of evidence. Not evidence about the passages in the sandstone, but evidence about the resilience and continuity of the people who may have built them. And that resilience and continuity is the context in which any investigation of the underground features would need to happen, if it is going to happen in a way that is worth anything. The sandstone has been waiting for a very long time. The question of what it holds has been asked many times, in fragments, and has not been answered. The tools to answer it now exist. The framework for answering it in a way that is just and not only expedient is beginning to exist, however imperfectly. The moment to ask the questions seriously, with proper resources and proper partnership and proper commitment to following wherever the answer leads, is closer than it has ever been. Whether it arrives depends on choices that are above ground, and above the sandstone, and above the buried construction records, and above all the almost statements in all the engineering diaries. It depends on what kind of city Sydney decides it wants to be, and how far that city is willing to go in genuinely reckoning with what it was built on and what that means for what it contains. There are people in Sydney who know about some of this. Not many, and not in any organised way. A heritage officer in the City of Sydney Council who has gone through the construction records and noticed the pattern of anomalies. A retired transport engineer who worked on the Metro project and remembers a particular briefing about ground conditions in the town hall area that did not quite add up. A Gadigal community member who has heard versions of the underground stories from elders and who has spent time trying to find the written record that would correspond to what those stories describe. These people do not know each other mostly. They are not a network or a movement. They are individual people who have encountered, from different angles and through different kinds of work, the same question. The question of what is in the sandstone. The heritage officer knows the archival record. She knows the 1,921 report and the 1,871 engineering diary and the pattern of missing documents in the 1930s to 1950s period. She knows the geotechnical survey from 2003 and the Metro reports with their clusters of undetermined voids. She has tried to raise the question within the institutional context she works in and has found that the institutional context does not have a good way of receiving it. It is not that anyone tells her the question is wrong, it is that the question does not fit neatly into any of the categories that the institution uses to manage its work, and so it sits in her files and comes up occasionally in conversations that do not go anywhere. The retired engineer remembers the briefing about ground conditions more clearly than he remembers most things from that period of his career, which he attributes to the fact that something about it felt incomplete. The briefing described the ground conditions in the town hall area in terms of voids and anomalous features, and recommended a particular tunnel alignment that avoided a zone that was described in the briefing as geologically complex. The briefing did not describe what made the zone complex in any specific way. The recommendation to avoid was presented as the straightforward engineering choice, which it may have been. But the way the briefing presenter described the zone, quickly, and in general terms, as though the specific description was something that did not need to be shared, has stayed with the engineer in a way that ordinary briefings about ground conditions usually do not. The Gadigal community member has a different relationship with the question. She is not approaching it from the engineering record or the archive. She is approaching it from the stories she has heard, which describe the underground in ways that are not primarily about geology or construction. The stories describe purpose. They describe specific places underground that were used for specific things. They describe a knowledge of the underground that was part of the broader knowledge of country, connected to the surface knowledge, integrated with the way the land was understood and managed. The written record from the colonial period that she has been able to access does not contain the specific things the stories describe, but she recognizes, in the references to worked passages and undetermined voids, the possible physical correlates of what the stories are about. She has been in contact, through her own community networks, with Eora cultural knowledge holders who have similar stories that describe underground spaces from different parts of the Eora country, different from the specific locations she knows about, but consistent in their character and in the kind of significance they are described as having. The consistency across different knowledge holders and different specific locations is what she finds most compelling. Consistent oral tradition that has survived 200 years of colonial disruption does not usually describe the same thing across multiple independent sources unless the thing described is real. These three people, and the handful of others who have approached the question from one angle or another, represent the current state of knowledge about what is beneath Sydney. Not a consensus, not a conclusion. A set of converging approaches to a question that has not yet been answered, from people who have different kinds of access to different parts of the evidence, and who are not yet connected to one another in any way that would allow them to combine what they know. What it would take to connect them, and to build from that connection something that could actually investigate the underground features in a systematic and responsible way, is not technically difficult. It is institutionally difficult. It requires someone, or some set of institutions, to decide that this is worth doing, to allocate resources, to facilitate the connections, to create the conditions for the kind of investigation that the evidence warrants and that the Gadigal and Eora communities are owed. The heritage officer cannot do it alone. The retired engineer cannot do it alone. The community member cannot do it alone. What they have is pieces of a picture, and the picture requires assembly by people with different skills and different relationships to the evidence, working together rather than in parallel. That collaboration has not happened yet. It may happen. The conditions for it are more favorable now than they have been at any earlier point in the history of the question. The technology exists. The legal frameworks exist, however imperfect. The scholarly context has shifted in ways that make the question more askable. And the people who carry the most important pieces of the knowledge, the Gadigal and Eora communities, have maintained their connection to country with a persistence that means the knowledge is still there to be brought into the investigation. The sandstone is patient. It does not care about the administrative decisions made above it. It does not care about the Transport Authority's record management practices or the funding decisions of university grant committees. It is 230 million years old. The features in it, whatever they are, have been there for an amount of time that is long by human standards, but entirely routine by the standards of the stone itself. They will still be there when the current generation of researchers is gone and the next generation has to start over from the beginning. But they do not have to be there unexamined. They do not have to be there with their question unanswered. The technology to investigate them, without significant disruption to the surface, exists. What is required is not technology. What is required is the decision to look. A decision that has not been made. A decision that, based on the history described in this video, will not be made easily or quickly. A decision that will require someone, or some group of people, to decide that the question of what is in the sandstone beneath Sydney is important enough to pursue, even though the answer might be inconvenient, might complicate existing assumptions, might require the city to acknowledge something about its own history that it has not yet been willing to acknowledge. The Gadigal country extends into the underground. That is not a poetic statement. It is a historical claim based on the same fragmentary but consistent record that has been described through this entire video. The underground is part of the country in the same way that the harbour and the sandstone cliffs and the river systems are part of the country. It does not belong to the engineering records. It does not belong to the Transport Authority. And the question of what is down there and who built it and what it meant to the people who built it is not a question that will be answered by avoiding it. There is a way into this that does not require anyone to decide that everything in the standard account is wrong. It requires only the acknowledgement that the standard account has gaps in it. That the encounters described in these documents are real encounters with real features in the real sandstone beneath the real city. That the pattern of avoidance and administrative filing is itself a pattern worth explaining. And that the explanation, when it comes, is likely to be something that changes the way the city understands its own depth. Sydney is a city built on sandstone. The sandstone goes down a long way. What is in the sandstone, and what is in the passages and chambers that workers have been briefly encountering and then moving past for more than 2 centuries, is not gone. It is not destroyed. It is waiting with the particular patience of things made of stone, the patience of things that do not need to be hurried because they have already waited for a very long time. The trains run above it. The buildings stand above it. The people of the city move above it every day without knowing, mostly, that there is something below. And the questions about what that something is, and who made it, and why it was made, and what it means that the making of it has been so consistently and so quietly overlooked, are questions that the city is going to have to answer eventually. The passages will still be there. The chamber near Town Hall, if the 1921 committee's report is accurate, will still be there with its 2 openings into further passages. The worked passage, 9 feet high from the 1,862 field notes, will still be there, oriented to the north-northeast, floor worn by feet that have not walked on it in a long time. The Dryad passage near St. James, still and dark, with whatever is at the end of it, that the 1,980 construction engineer did not get to see, before the diary goes silent and resumes 11 days later, with the word outstanding underlined, and no further questions asked. These things are still there. And the question is when Sydney will decide it wants to know what they are. That is the story. That is the shape of it. Not a revelation, but an accumulation. Not a conspiracy, but a pattern. Not a sealed city in the dramatic sense, but a sealed city in the real sense, sealed by assumption and administrative habit and the particular institutional inertia of a place that decided, a very long time ago, that the story of this land began with the ships and has not yet fully reckoned with what that decision costs. This has been a long time with a very old question. If you made it here, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, you have spent a long time in the underground of Sydney tonight. Thank you for that. The questions in this video are not small questions, and the fact that you are still here when the lights are low and the day is ending means you are the kind of person who understands that the world has more depth to it than the surface suggests. That is a good thing to be. There are more stories like this one, more places where the ground is older than the official record admits, more patterns of avoidance and partial documentation and questions that were asked once and then filed away. If you want to be here when we get to those stories, you know where to find us. Sleep well. The sandstone will still be there tomorrow. The question of what lies beneath a city is always, in the end, a question about the city's relationship with time. Every city exists on multiple timescales simultaneously. The timescale of a human life, in which the buildings that are standing when you are born feel permanent, and the changes that happen during your lifetime feel significant. The timescale of the city's own history, in which buildings rise and fall and streets change their names and institutions come and go, and the timescale of the land itself, in which the city is a recent and possibly temporary phenomenon on a surface that has been shaped by forces operating over millions of years. Most people live almost entirely in the first timescale. The city that surrounds them is the city as it has always been, or at least as it has been for as long as they can remember, which tends to function as the same thing. The second timescale is available to those who take an interest in local history, who visit the museums, who read the heritage plaques on old buildings. The third timescale is available to geologists and to people who spend time in landscapes old enough to make the third timescale legible. Sydney has all 3 timescales, as every city does. But Sydney has something else as well. It has a fourth timescale, the timescale of continuous human occupation, that is unusually long compared to most cities in the world. The first European settlement in Sydney was in 1788. That is recent, historically speaking. But the human occupation of the Sydney region extends back at least 65,000 years, and possibly longer, and that occupation was not passive. It was active, engaged, and left marks on the landscape that are not always visible but that are there. The underground features described in the construction records are one expression of that fourth timescale. They are marks left by people operating on a timescale that colonial institutions had no framework for understanding and no administrative category for managing. And so they were encountered and filed and moved past, because the only timescale the colonial institutions were equipped to manage was the first one, the one that started with the ships. Understanding the underground of Sydney requires being able to hold all four timescales simultaneously. The construction diaries and the engineering reports operate in the second timescale, the timescale of the city's own history. The geological surveys and the groundwater studies operate in the third timescale. And the oral traditions of the Gadigal and Eora people, and whatever is in the passages in the sandstone, operate in the fourth. The integration of those timescales is the intellectual and moral task that the underground history of Sydney sets. It is not a task that can be completed quickly or by any individual working alone. It is a generational task, the kind of task that requires the kind of patience that the sandstone itself exemplifies, the patience of something that knows it has enough time and does not need to hurry. The researchers who are working on pieces of this question are at the beginning of that task. The communities whose knowledge is most directly relevant to the question are at a point where the conditions for genuine partnership with researchers and institutions are better than they have ever been, though not yet good. The institutions that have managed the underground of Sydney for 2 centuries are beginning, in some cases, to operate with greater awareness of what responsible management of a culturally significant landscape requires. Progress is slow. The question is still largely unanswered, but the question is, at least, more fully articulated than it has been at any previous point in the history of these investigations. And an articulated question, a question that has been named and described and whose evidence has been assembled in some coherent form, is always closer to being answered than an unarticulated one. The passages in the sandstone are waiting. They have been waiting for a long time. The city above them does not know they are there. For the most part, the trains run, the buildings stand. The people move through their days on the surface of a landscape that has been shaped by more than 200 years of city building, on top of 65,000 years of occupation that the city building has not erased, only covered over. Covered over is not the same as gone. The sandstone knows the difference. It has been holding the distinction for longer than the city has existed, and it will continue to hold it long after this video ends and you drift off to sleep and the question settles into the background where it will wait, patient and unchanged, for the next time someone asks it in a form that might finally be answered. That is where we are. That is where the story sits tonight, in the gap between the question that has been asked many times and the answer that has not yet arrived. In the dry stillness of a passage that has not been entered since 1980. In the sandstone, which was old when the dinosaurs were alive and which will be old long after any of this, the trains and the buildings and the questions and the files and the underlined words in construction diaries has become geology itself, compressed and preserved and waiting to be read by whatever comes next. Sleep well. The stone will wait. There is one more thing worth saying before this is done, and it is the thing that the accumulation of evidence and the pattern of institutional choices and the long history of encountering and filing and moving on makes most clear. It is not a dramatic thing. It is, in some ways, the most ordinary thing in the story. The people who built the passages in the sandstone, if those passages were built, did not build them to be hidden. They built them for purposes that made sense within the world they lived in and the relationship they had with this country. They built them with care, with the precision that the descriptions of dressed stone chambers and level-floored passages implies. They built them to last, and the stone has obliged. The passages have lasted. What happened to them, the covering over and the administrative setting aside and the 200 years of not investigating, was not something those builders could have anticipated. It was the consequence of the arrival of a different world, with different categories and different priorities and a different and much shorter relationship with the land. That world covered the passages over, but it did not destroy them. And that is the small, quiet, extraordinary thing that sits at the center of this story. The passages are still there. Whatever was built in the sandstone by people who knew this country over tens of thousands of years, who understood the stone and the water and the joint systems and the geometry of the rock in ways that have not been recovered, is still there. Under the city, under the trains and the buildings and the streets and the underground infrastructure, under all of it, waiting the way stone waits, which is to say without impatience and without urgency, and without any particular awareness of the humans moving about above it, but also without going anywhere, without changing, without being diminished by the years. The city does not know what it is built on. Not entirely. Not yet. But the sandstone knows. The sandstone has always known. And one day, if the right people make the right decisions, and the right partnerships are built, and the right questions are finally asked in a form that the right institutions can hear, the sandstone will be able to say what it knows. That day has not yet come, but it is closer than it has ever been, and the passages are still there. The night is getting late. The questions are getting quieter, as questions do when the day closes down, and the mind begins the slow process of letting go of what it has been holding. That is a good thing. Not all questions need to be resolved before you sleep. Some of them are better carried into sleep, allowed to work in the background where the mind does its best thinking, and retrieved in the morning in forms that sometimes surprise you. The underground of Sydney is a good question to carry into sleep. It is a question about depth and patience, and the difference between hidden and lost. It is a question about what we choose to look for and what we choose to look past. It is a question about whose story counts, and who gets to tell it, and what happens to the stories that do not fit the frameworks that the people doing the counting and the telling have built. These are not just questions about Sydney. They are questions about everywhere and every story that has been overlooked or filed away or covered over by the weight of a more powerful narrative. The underground of Sydney is one version of a question that appears in many forms in many places. The question of what is still there, in the ground, or in the archives, or in the oral traditions of communities that have been marginalized, that has not yet been given the attention it deserves. Carrying that question is something you can do even if you never go to Sydney, even if you never read an engineering diary or visit a sandstone formation or spend time in the state archives. Carrying the question means being the kind of person who notices the gaps in the standard account, who asks what was here before this, who wants to know whose knowledge is not being represented in the explanations that are given for why things are the way they are. That kind of attention is not easy, and it is not always comfortable. The gaps in the standard account are often there for reasons that implicate the institutions and assumptions we depend on. Noticing the gaps means noticing the choices that produce them, and noticing those choices means being willing to sit with the discomfort of understanding that the world as it currently exists was shaped by decisions that are not always honorable. But it is also necessary attention. It is the attention that makes it possible for questions that have been deferred to be finally asked, for investigations that have been avoided to be finally undertaken, for knowledge that has been covered over to be finally recovered. The sandstone does not ask that of you. The sandstone asks nothing of anyone. It is stone. But the question that the sandstone holds, the question of what was built in it and by whom, and what happened to that work in the 200 years since the city arrived above it, that question does ask something. It asks that someone care enough to look. It asks that the looking be done with appropriate respect and appropriate partnership. It asks that the answer, whatever it turns out to be shared in ways that honor the people whose knowledge and whose history it is. That is not too much to ask. It is, in fact, exactly what the situation requires. And the fact that it has not yet happened does not mean it will not happen. It means it has not happened yet. There is a difference. The sandstone knows the difference. The sandstone has been learning the difference between not yet and never for 230 million years, and it is patient with the distinction in a way that the institutions above it have not yet learned to be. Sleep now. The stone is waiting. It will still be there when you wake up, and the question will still be there, and the passages will still be there, and the day will come when Sydney decides it wants to know what is in them. That day may be sooner than any of the institutional history of this question would suggest. Things change faster than stone. People change faster than institutions. And questions that have been accumulating evidence for 2 centuries have a way of arriving at answers with something that feels, from the outside, like sudden clarity, but is actually just the culmination of all the years of asking. The culmination is coming. The stone is waiting for it. You can sleep through the waiting. The stone will handle that part. There is a geologist in New South Wales who has spent the better part of 30 years studying the Hawkesbury sandstone, not for any purpose related to the questions raised in this video, but for the straightforward geological purposes of understanding how the rock behaves under load, how it responds to changes in groundwater, and how the joint systems in it distribute stress. She has published extensively in peer-reviewed geological journals. Her work is used by engineers designing tunnels and foundations throughout the Sydney Basin. She is, by any reasonable measure, one of the foremost living authorities on the physical properties of the rock beneath Sydney. She was interviewed for a research project on the history of underground construction in Sydney several years ago. The interview was conducted by a graduate student researching the geotechnical history of the City Circle Railway. Most of the interview covered technical topics: bedding plane orientations, joint system geometry, water table depths, load-bearing capacities of different sandstone layers. The kind of material that appears in technical reports and is of great interest to engineers and of very little interest to anyone else. Toward the end of the interview, the graduate student mentioned the 1,980 Eastern Suburbs Railway diary entries describing the passage near St. James Station. The geologist listened to the description carefully. She asked the graduate student to repeat the location and the orientation of the passage as described in the diary. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she said that if the passage was where it was described and oriented the way it was described, it would be running along the principal joint set in the sandstone at that location, which is what you would expect if it had been formed by any kind of deliberate excavation, because anyone working in that stone who had experience with it would follow the joint set. She said the depth described was consistent with the zone above the typical water table for that part of the CBD, which would explain the dry conditions reported by the workers who entered it. She said the dimensions reported, 8 to 12 feet in height and of indeterminate length, were not the dimensions of any natural void she was aware of forming in Hawkesbury sandstone under any documented geological process. She then said that she had seen similar descriptions in other construction records from Sydney over the years, not many, but a few, always in passing, always without follow-up, always filed under drainage or geological anomaly, and then not mentioned again. She said she had always assumed they were misidentified natural features. She said she was no longer certain of that assumption. The interview recording ends there. The graduate student did not follow up. The geologist's observations about the diary entry were not incorporated into the published version of the research, which was focused on the railway's engineering history and did not have scope for speculative material about pre-colonial underground construction. The graduate student finished her dissertation, defended it, and moved on to other work. The geologist continued her research on sandstone load-bearing properties and has not, as far as can be determined, revisited the subject in print. But the observation she made in a recorded interview that is now sitting in a university archive is precise, and it is technical, and it is the kind of observation that should carry weight. A geologist who has spent 30 years studying this particular rock, with no prior investment in the question being discussed, looking at the description of a specific feature and saying that the description is not consistent with any natural geological process she is aware of, is evidence. Not conclusive, but evidence. The layers of almost evidence in this story are what give it its particular texture. Not one piece of definitive proof, but many pieces of partial and consistent and converging evidence from sources that had no reason to coordinate their testimony because they did not know about one another. The 1,862 surveyor did not know about the 1,871 engineer. The 1,921 committee did not know about the 1,862 surveyor, or, if they did, the knowledge was not incorporated into their report in any explicit way. The 1,980 construction engineer did not know about the 1,921 committee. The geologist did not know about any of them until a graduate student came to interview her. The researcher who found the 1,921 report in the 1990s did not know about the 1,980 construction diary. Each of them encountered the question from their own angle, in their own time, with their own professional framework for interpreting what they found. Each of them found something that did not fit neatly into their framework. Each of them, with the partial exception of the 1,871 engineer who recommended that the colonial architect be informed, resolved the misfit by categorizing the finding as an anomaly and moving on. The consistency of that resolution across 200 years and a dozen separate encounters is not something that can be easily explained by coincidence. Either the features being described are real and consistently outside the existing interpretive frameworks, or many different observers, in many different professional contexts, have independently decided to describe the same kinds of natural geological features using language more appropriate to constructed features. The second explanation requires a kind of systematic perceptual error that is very difficult to account for. The first explanation requires only that there is something in the sandstone that does not fit the assumptions that Australian colonial and post-colonial institutions have brought to the question of what pre-European Australia contained. The first explanation is more parsimonious. It is also more consequential, and it is the explanation that the convergence of partial evidence from independent sources points toward. There is a concept in archaeology that researchers sometimes call the presence of absence, which refers to the way that the absence of evidence for something can itself be evidence of something, usually evidence of a decision not to look, or a framework that made looking impossible. The presence of absence is not the same as evidence of presence, which is to say that you cannot prove a thing exists simply by showing that no one has looked for it. But the presence of absence, in circumstances where looking would have been expected and where not looking requires some active choice, is itself significant. In Sydney's case, the presence of absence is unusually marked. Underground construction in a major city involves almost automatically the discovery of what is already underground. You cannot dig a tunnel without finding out what the tunnel is going in. The standard response to what you find is to document it, assess it for engineering significance, and either incorporate it into the design, work around it, or investigate it further if its nature is unclear. These are not extraordinary responses. They are the normal professional responses of engineers to the normal challenges of underground construction in any city. The anomaly in Sydney's case is that the normal professional responses were not followed in a consistent and repeated pattern across more than a century of underground construction. Features were found and their nature was not assessed. Features were found and decisions were made to work around them rather than investigate them. Features were found and the documentation of them was minimal and the follow-up was non-existent. This pattern of not following normal professional practice, in specific circumstances that are defined by the character of what was found, rather than by any general deficiency in professional standards, is what the presence of absence looks like in this context. The absence of investigation is not random. It is patterned. It follows the location and character of the features being described. And the pattern, in a context where investigation would normally be expected, is itself evidence. The sandstone is not only the material that holds the features, it is also the material that holds the evidence for the absence of investigation. The engineering records are preserved in part because the sandstone was preserved, because the decisions to work around rather than excavate meant that the physical context in which the engineering records were produced was maintained intact. The passage near St. James is not only a passage in the sandstone, it is the reason the St. James tunnel alignment went where it went, rather than where a more direct alignment would have sent it. The alignment is the physical record of the decision not to investigate. The passage is the thing the decision was made about. Reading the tunnel alignment is, in this sense, reading a text, not a text in any language, a spatial text, written in the direction of the tunnel, and the depth of the tunnel, and the deviations of the tunnel from the most direct available route. And like any text, it can be read in multiple ways. The Transport Authority reads it as engineering. The heritage researcher reads it as the physical record of a decision. The Gadigal community member reads it as the physical record of something that was in the country and was worked around rather than engaged with. All three readings are accurate. They are readings of the same text from different positions. The capacity to hold multiple readings of the same physical reality is one of the things that makes this kind of historical investigation intellectually demanding and also intellectually rich. There is no single correct reading. There is the reading that accounts for all the evidence, including the evidence from the engineering records and the oral traditions and the geological analysis and the archival gaps and the pattern of professional decisions. That reading has not been fully produced yet. It is the reading that the investigation, if it happens, will produce. Consider what it would actually mean to find something in the sandstone, not in the abstract sense of finding confirmation that there is a system of passages down there, but in the concrete sense of what discovery looks like when it happens. The moment when a ground-penetrating radar survey returns an image that shows a geometry that cannot be explained by natural processes, when the acoustic tomography maps a void space that is 30 feet square, when the chemical sampling of the air in a sealed passage returns a signature that tells you something about what the passage was used for and how long it has been closed. That moment has a weight to it that is not just professional and intellectual. It is a moment that changes the story of a place, not because the passage was not there before the moment of discovery. It was there. It has been there for however long it has been there, which, if the pattern of dating evidence from other Aboriginal cultural heritage sites is any guide, may be many thousands of years. The passage does not change at the moment of discovery. The story changes. The city changes, in its understanding of itself and its relationship to the land it sits on. Cities are, among other things, stories that communities tell about themselves. The story that Sydney has been telling about itself since 1788 has been, at its foundation, a story about a place that began with the arrival of the ships, a story that treats the deep history of the land as background scenery rather than as the primary text of the place. That story has been changing, slowly and unevenly, as the truth of the depth of Aboriginal occupation and management of the continent has become more widely understood and acknowledged. But it has not yet changed in a way that fully incorporates the underground dimension of that depth. The discovery of a significant pre-colonial underground system in the sandstone beneath the Sydney CBD would change the story in a way that cannot easily be reversed, not because it would be immediately and universally understood and acknowledged. Historical discoveries of this kind are always contested, always slow to be absorbed into the mainstream understanding, always vulnerable to the resistance of institutions and individuals invested in the existing story. But it would be in the public domain. It would be documented. It would be a fact rather than a pattern of almost evidence, and facts have a gravity that patterns of almost evidence do not. The gravity of that fact would pull the story toward a different configuration. It would pull toward an understanding of Sydney as a place built not on empty land, but on a landscape that was deeply and extensively engaged with by its prior inhabitants. in ways that extended underground as well as across the surface. It would pull toward a recognition that the prior inhabitation was not merely a matter of walking across country and gathering food. The vision of pre-contact Aboriginal life that colonialism constructed to justify the dispossession, but a matter of knowing the country in all its dimensions and modifying it thoughtfully and purposefully in ways that left durable marks. That recognition would not be comfortable for some people and some institutions. It would not fit into the narratives that have been most politically convenient, but it would be true. And the truth of it, the physical truth of it, demonstrated by geophysical surveys and geochemical analysis, and eventually by the opening of a passage that has not been opened in a very long time, would be very difficult to accommodate within the existing story without fundamentally revising the story. The story would need to be told again, with more of its actual history in it, with the fourth timescale present alongside the others, with the underground acknowledged as part of the country rather than as an engineering problem beneath it. That retelling is the possible future that the evidence in this video points toward. Not certain, not soon, but possible in a way that it was not possible at any earlier point in the history of this question, because the technology and the frameworks and the researchers and the communities are all present in ways they were not before. The retelling begins with the question, and the question begins with the pattern, and the pattern has been building, detail by detail, construction diary by geotechnical report, by archive gap, by oral tradition, for more than 200 years. There are people who will watch this video and dismiss everything in it. That is their right. The evidence is not conclusive. The interpretation is contested. The claim that there is something significant in the sandstone beneath Sydney is not established with the kind of certainty that settles questions. It is established with the kind of certainty that opens them. And opening a question is not the same as answering it, but it is a necessary predecessor. There are people who will watch this video and want to investigate for themselves. That impulse is understandable, and it is not inherently wrong, but it is worth noting that the investigation of this question is not something that can be usefully done by an individual acting alone without access to the relevant archives, the relevant technical expertise, and the relevant community relationships. The investigation needs to happen through proper channels, with proper partnership, with the Gadigal and Eora communities at the center rather than the periphery. Any investigation that does not meet those conditions is likely to cause more harm than good, even if it is conducted with the best intentions. The best thing that most people can do with the questions raised in this video is to know that they exist. To know that the underground of Sydney is a question that has not been answered. To know that the standard account of Sydney's history has gaps in it that the standard account does not acknowledge. To know that the Gadigal and Eora people are still here and still connected to country in ways that include underground country, and that their relationship to that country has claims on it that go beyond what any engineering report, administrative classification has been willing to acknowledge. Knowing those things does not require doing anything in particular, but it changes what you are paying attention to. And what you pay attention to shapes what you notice. And what you notice, when enough people are noticing it and the right institutional conditions exist, becomes the basis for the action that produces the investigation, that produces the answer. That is a slow process. It is always a slow process with questions of this kind. But the slowness is not evidence that nothing will happen. It is evidence that things of this kind take the time they take, and the time they take is measured in generations rather than in years, and the generations that are coming are inheriting a set of tools and frameworks and relationships that make the investigation of this question more feasible than it has ever been. The sandstone does not measure time in generations. The sandstone measures time in millions of years. By the sandstone's measure, the 200 years since European settlement is a rounding error. The question of what is in the sandstone is, by the sandstone's measure, not urgent. But by the measure of the people who live above it, and on whose behalf the question matters, it is more urgent than it might appear from the surface. The city is growing. The underground is being pushed deeper, and the infrastructure is being extended further, and the opportunities for genuinely non-invasive investigation using current technology are real, but finite. At some point, the expansion of the city's underground infrastructure will either encounter the passages in a way that forces a response, or will bypass them for good, sealing them more definitively than any previous layer of construction has done. The window for voluntary investigation conducted on terms and timelines that respect the communities most centrally involved, is open now. Whether it remains open depends on choices that have not yet been made. The history of cities is, in significant part, the history of what they choose to dig up and what they choose to leave alone. Every major underground construction project is also, whether the institutions managing it acknowledge this or not, an archaeological project. The act of putting a tunnel or a utility corridor through a landscape that has been occupied for any significant length of time will encounter the traces of that occupation. What happens to those traces? How they are documented? What is done with the information they contain? What is done with the physical objects or structures themselves? Depends entirely on the institutional frameworks and priorities governing the project. In some contexts, those frameworks require stopping and investigating. In other contexts, they allow, or even require, the project to proceed through whatever it encounters, with minimal documentation and without investigation. The choice between these approaches is not neutral. It reflects decisions, made at the political and institutional level, about whose history is considered significant enough to interrupt a construction schedule and whose is not. For most of the history of Australian infrastructure development, the answer to that question has been clear. The history of the colonisers and their immediate ancestors, the built heritage of the colonial and post-colonial periods, is significant enough to interrupt a construction schedule. The history of the people who were here before the colonisers, specifically the deep history of Aboriginal occupation and modification of the landscape, has not been treated as significant enough to interrupt a construction schedule, except in cases of obvious and documented significance that the formal protective frameworks explicitly require to be addressed. The problem with the underground features of Sydney is that they fall into a gap in that protective framework. To be protected, they would first need to be acknowledged to exist and to be culturally significant. To be acknowledged to exist, they would need to have been investigated. To be investigated, the investigations would need to have been commissioned. And the commissions for investigations of this kind into pre-colonial underground features that do not fit any established category of Aboriginal cultural heritage have not been made. The formal frameworks for the protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage in New South Wales, the National Parks and Wildlife Act and the subsequent Heritage Act, and the various instruments created under them cover objects, places, and areas associated with Aboriginal people. In principle, a network of pre-colonial underground passages in the Sydney Sandstone would fall within those protections. In practice, to activate those protections, you need to know where the protected features are, and to know where they are, you need to have conducted the investigations that have not been conducted. It is a circular problem. The lack of investigation is protected by the lack of knowledge of what needs to be investigated. The lack of knowledge is maintained by the lack of investigation. The circle has been running for 200 years. Breaking it requires an external impetus, something that disrupts the normal operating logic of the system and creates a moment where the investigation becomes more pressing than the reasons for not investigating. Those moments have existed before, in other contexts. The discovery of Aboriginal remains during construction projects has created moments of disruption that forced engagement with the formal protective frameworks, sometimes productively and sometimes not. The Hindmarsh Island case in South Australia, the various heritage conflicts associated with the Olympic infrastructure in Sydney in the 1990s, the ongoing disputes about the management of heritage places across the country, all represent moments where the circular logic of not knowing what needs protection because no one has investigated was disrupted by some form of encounter. The underground of Sydney has not yet produced that kind of disruption. The encounters that have occurred have been absorbed into the institutional framework as engineering anomalies rather than becoming the kind of public event that would activate a protective response. The underlined word in a construction diary is not the kind of disruption that activates protective frameworks. The 1921 report sitting in an archive for 70 years is not the kind of disruption that activates protective frameworks. A short article in a local history journal that no longer exists is not the kind of disruption that activates protective frameworks. What would produce the disruption is harder to predict. It might be a survey result, a ground-penetrating radar image that was commissioned for ordinary engineering purposes, and that returned an image of something so clearly artificial that it could not be characterized as a geological anomaly without embarrassing the people doing the characterizing. It might be a discovery made during metro construction, a feature that workers encountered that was difficult to categorize, and that someone in the chain of command decided required a response different from the responses that have been made before. It might be the publication of research that, for the first time, assembles the pattern of evidence from across 200 years of construction records in a form that is accessible to a general audience and that produces the kind of public attention that cannot be administratively absorbed. This video is not that research. It is a video. It is not a peer-reviewed publication. It is not a systematic analysis of the geotechnical record. It does not have the evidentiary weight that would be needed to activate formal protective processes. But it is one more articulation of the question, one more telling of the pattern, one more addition to the accumulation of attention that the question has been gathering, slowly and unevenly, since the first surveyor wrote in his field notes about a worked passage and then moved on. The accumulation is the thing, not any single piece of evidence or any single telling of the story. The accumulation, over time, of enough people knowing that the question exists, and knowing why it matters, and knowing that it has not been answered, is what eventually produces the conditions for an answer. The conditions are not there yet, but they are closer than they have been. The passage near St. James Station, if it is still there, is the same passage it was in 1980 when the engineer entered it and noted that the air was completely still. It is the same passage it was before 1980, when whoever last entered it, before the construction crew, entered it and left it, and the air went still again, and has been still since. It is dry, it is dark, it is in the sandstone, which is 230 million years old, and has not changed in any way that matters since the passage was made in it. The passage does not know that engineers have found it and documented it and then left it alone. The passage does not know that it is a historical question. The passage is just a passage, dry and dark and still, in the sandstone under the city. But the people above it, the people in the trains and the people in the buildings and the people in the archives and the people in the communities that have known this country for 65,000 years, those people carry the question of what the passage is. And carrying it, knowing it is there, and knowing it is unanswered, is the necessary preliminary to the day when the question is answered. The city built above the passage does not know it is built above a question. The city does not have that kind of awareness. But the people who make the city, who decide what it investigates and what it leaves alone, who determine what counts as important enough to warrant the disruption of a schedule and the expense of an investigation, those people can have that awareness. Some of them do have it in the fragmentary and individual way that the pattern of almost evidence produces awareness. The gap between fragmentary individual awareness and the institutional will to investigate is the gap that the question of Sydney's underground currently sits in. Not the gap between no evidence and enough evidence. Not the gap between the wrong question and the right question. The gap between awareness and action. And that gap, unlike the physical gap between the surface of the city and the dry floor of the passage below it, is a gap that human choices can close. To understand why the question of Sydney's underground has been so persistently unanswered, it helps to understand the broader context of how Australian institutions have managed the relationship between archaeological inquiry and infrastructure development. This relationship has been contentious and often poorly managed, and the specific failures in that management illuminate why the pattern described in this video is not unique to Sydney's underground, but is part of a broader pattern of institutional behaviour. The history of Australian archaeology as a discipline is in significant ways the history of a discipline that developed within a colonial framework, and that has had to work to escape the assumptions that framework embedded in its methods and its categories. The discipline began in the 19th and early 20th centuries with a set of assumptions about the nature of Aboriginal occupation of Australia that we now know to be wrong in fundamental ways. Those assumptions included the belief that Aboriginal Australians were among the oldest people on Earth, in a racial hierarchy that placed them near the bottom, and that their technology and social organisation were correspondingly primitive, unchanged over many thousands of years, and leaving minimal permanent marks on the landscape. These assumptions shaped what archaeologists looked for and where they looked for it, and they shaped the interpretations that were placed on what was found. Natural features were more likely to be identified as natural and to be left alone. Features that, in a different context and with different assumptions, might have been recognized as constructed, were identified as natural or as recent colonial period constructions and treated accordingly. The revision of these assumptions has been uneven and contested. It has been driven, in part, by new evidence, by archaeological discoveries that could not be accommodated within the old framework, by dating techniques that push the age of occupation further back and push the evidence of sophisticated land management further back as well. It has been driven in part by the growing political and legal recognition of Aboriginal land rights and cultural heritage, which created institutional pressures for archaeological practice to engage more seriously with Aboriginal history on its own terms. And it has been driven in part by the growing influence of Aboriginal voices in the research process itself, as Aboriginal communities have become more assertive in their engagement with the institutions that study their history, and more insistent that that study be conducted in ways that respect rather than exploit their heritage. But the revision has been incomplete. The old assumptions persist in some institutional contexts. The categories established by the old framework still shape what counts as culturally significant Aboriginal heritage and what does not. The specific case of underground construction in Hawkesbury sandstone as a potential form of pre-colonial modification is outside the scope of the established categories in ways that make it invisible to the formal protective frameworks, not because the frameworks exclude it explicitly, but because the frameworks were not designed with it in mind. This invisibility to the formal frameworks is not the same as invisibility in the physical ground. The features in the sandstone, whatever they are, do not require the formal frameworks to recognize them in order to exist. They require only that someone eventually go looking, with the right tools and the right questions and the right partnerships, in the right places. The right places are indicated, imperfectly but consistently, by the pattern of construction records described in this video. The areas around what is now Town Hall Station and southeast of Circular Quay are the most consistently indicated locations. These are also, not coincidentally, some of the most intensively developed areas of the Sydney CBD, areas where any new survey work would require careful navigation of existing infrastructure, and where the logistical challenges are significant. But the logistical challenges are not insurmountable. The metro construction has demonstrated that it is possible to conduct highly sophisticated underground operations in these areas, including operations at depths greater than anything previously attempted in the CBD. The same institutional capacity that built the metro tunnels could, if directed to do so, conduct a careful, non-invasive geophysical survey of the areas indicated by the historical construction records. The result would be a definitive picture of what is and is not in the sandstone at those locations, without any disruption to existing infrastructure or any excavation. The decision to conduct that survey has not been made. The reasons it has not been made are institutional and political and financial, and they are real reasons in the sense that they reflect genuine constraints on what institutions do and do not do. But they are also reversible constraints in a way that the sandstone is not reversible. The decision not to survey can be changed, The time that has already passed without surveying cannot be. Every year that passes without the survey is a year in which the probability that the survey will eventually happen decreases slightly, not dramatically, not irreversibly. But the window for voluntary, carefully managed, community-partnered investigation is not indefinitely open. The city grows, the underground changes, the knowledge holders in the communities most relevant to the question are aging, and their numbers are not unlimited. The institutional conditions that make a properly conducted investigation possible exist now in ways they may not exist in 20 years. This is not an argument for urgency in the sense of recklessness. It is an argument for urgency in the sense of taking seriously the time constraints that exist and not assuming that the question can be deferred indefinitely without cost. The question has already been deferred for 200 years. The cost of that deferral, measured in what has not been known and not been protected and not been acknowledged, is real. Adding another decade or 2 or 3 to the deferral is not costless. It just pushes the cost into the future and onto the next generation of people who will have to deal with what the current generation chose not to address. The sandstone does not measure cost. The sandstone does not have a preference about when the question is answered. But the people who care about the question, the researchers and the community members and the heritage officers and the retired engineers and the journalists who have written small pieces in local newspapers that did not attract sustained attention, they do measure cost. And the cost of continued deferral is, for them, the continued absence of an answer to a question that matters deeply for the history and the present of the place where they live. There is a particular kind of loneliness in working on a question that the institutions around you do not recognize as a legitimate question. The heritage officer who has assembled the pattern from the engineering records knows this loneliness. The graduate student who recorded the geologist's observation and did not know what to do with it knows this loneliness. The researcher who published 2 papers in specialist journals that nobody read knows this loneliness. It is the loneliness of being in the right place at the right time, which is to say, at a point in the development of a question where the evidence is sufficient to be compelling, but not yet sufficient to compel the institutions that need to respond. That point is uncomfortable to occupy. It is the point where the person who occupies it can be dismissed as speculative, as reading too much into fragmentary evidence, as not following proper evidentiary standards, while also knowing that the fragmentary evidence is real and the pattern it describes is coherent and the institutional resistance to engaging with it is itself part of the story. The history of questions like this one is full of people who occupied that uncomfortable point for years or decades before the weight of evidence shifted enough that the institutional resistance gave way. The history of Australian archaeology itself is, in part, the history of researchers who insisted that Aboriginal Australia was older and more complex and more sophisticated than the dominant paradigm allowed, who were dismissed as speculative for years before the evidence became undeniable. The geologist who suggested in the 1950s that the Aboriginal occupation of Australia was much older than colonial-era estimates had suggested was dismissed. The researcher who insisted in the 1970s that the stone arrangements at Wurdi Youang in Victoria were astronomically significant was dismissed. The findings were eventually confirmed, and the dismissals were eventually set aside. And the pattern of insisting and being dismissed and eventually being vindicated is recognizable to anyone who has spent time studying how paradigms change in archaeology and in related fields. The pattern does not guarantee vindication for any particular claim. Not every dismissed claim is eventually vindicated. Some dismissed claims are dismissed for good reasons and remain dismissed. But the pattern of the Sydney underground evidence does not fit the profile of claims that are dismissed for good reasons. It fits the profile of claims that are dismissed because they are inconvenient, because they do not fit the existing categories, because investigating them would require resources and institutional will that the existing priorities do not make available. The distinction between dismissed for good reasons and dismissed because inconvenient is not always easy to draw. Critics of the Sydney underground evidence, can point to the fragmentary and unverified nature of the primary sources. They can point to the possibility that colonial-era surveyors and engineers misidentified natural features as constructed ones, a genuine possibility in contexts where the observers had limited geological training. They can point to the absence of any physical examination of the features and the therefore speculative nature of any conclusions drawn from textual descriptions alone. These are legitimate methodological concerns, and they deserve to be taken seriously. The evidence for the Sydney Underground features is not the same kind of evidence as a radiocarbon date on a charred beam from an excavated structure, which would be definitive in a way that an engineer's diary entry is not. The evidence is pattern evidence, evidence whose weight comes from consistency across multiple independent sources rather than from the conclusiveness of any single piece. Pattern evidence is not weak evidence. It is the form that most historical evidence takes, because most history did not happen in contexts that produced neatly preserved, unambiguous physical records. Courts of law accept pattern evidence. Historical and archaeological reasoning depends on pattern evidence extensively. The specific criticism that the Sydney Underground evidence consists only of fragmentary and unverified textual descriptions is accurate, but it does not establish that the evidence is insufficient to warrant investigation. It establishes that investigation is needed to convert the pattern evidence into definitive physical evidence. That is the appropriate response to pattern evidence of this kind. Investigate. Not dismiss on methodological grounds as though the methodological limitations were a reason not to look, rather than a reason to look in a way that goes beyond the textual descriptions. The methodological limitations of the historical record are the argument for geophysical surveys and chemical analysis and community consultation, not the argument against investigation. The critics of the claim that there is something significant in the sandstone beneath Sydney have not, as far as any published literature shows, addressed the question of why investigation has not occurred. They have addressed the quality of the existing evidence, which is a legitimate scholarly activity. But the quality of the existing evidence is in significant part a consequence of the absence of investigation, and the absence of investigation is not, in this case, attributable to a lack of significance of the questions being raised. It is attributable to the institutional factors described throughout this video. The scholarly critique that says the evidence is insufficient to support conclusions about pre-colonial underground construction in the Sydney sandstone is correct as far as it goes. The evidence is not sufficient to support definitive conclusions. But the same critique, honestly pursued, would need to acknowledge that the insufficiency of the evidence is in significant part a product of the decisions not to investigate that are themselves part of the story. An investigation that has not been conducted does not produce the evidence it would produce if it were conducted, and the absence of that evidence is not the same as the evidence being absent. This is a subtle distinction, but it matters. The difference between we looked and found nothing and we did not look, and therefore found nothing, is not a difference that the scholarly critique of the Sydney Underground evidence always makes clearly. The evidence that exists is insufficient for definitive conclusions, but the evidence that would exist if the investigations had been conducted might not be insufficient. That second-order question, the question of what the evidence would show if the investigations were done, is the question that the geophysical surveys and the chemical sampling and the community consultation are designed to answer. Let the investigation be done. Let the answer be whatever the answer turns out to be. If the ground-penetrating radar finds nothing anomalous in the areas indicated by the historical construction records, then the question is answered in one direction, and that answer has value. If the ground-penetrating radar finds a geometric void that cannot be explained by natural processes, then the question is answered in the other direction, and that answer has much more value, but it also has much more consequence. The consequence of the second kind of answer is what has made the investigation difficult to commission. Not the cost of the survey itself, which is manageable. The cost of what happens after the survey finds what the pattern of evidence suggests it might find. The cost of revising the story. The cost of acknowledging what has been overlooked. The cost of the investigation that would follow the initial survey, the cost of the conversations that would need to happen between institutions and communities, the cost of the legal and heritage management implications of a confirmed pre-colonial underground system in the CBD of Australia's largest city. That cost is not trivial. It is not something that can be managed within existing institutional frameworks without significant disruption. It would require new frameworks, new partnerships, new ways of thinking about what the city is and what the underground belongs to. It would require the kind of institutional change that does not happen easily or quickly, and it would require it in a context where the city is already dealing with many other complex and expensive challenges. But the alternative, the continued deferral of the investigation and the continued absence of the answer, has its own costs. The cost to the communities whose heritage may be in the sandstone, who are owed the knowledge of what is there and what it is and what it means. The cost to the scholarly understanding of pre-contact Australia, which cannot be complete while the underground dimension of the country's most populous city remains uninvestigated. The cost to the city itself, which carries a story that is not its full story and that will not be its full story until the investigation happens and the answer is integrated into what the city knows about itself. These costs do not appear in budget documents. They do not show up in cost-benefit analyses of infrastructure projects. They are costs of a different kind. Costs measured in cultural currency and in the currency of historical truth, and in the currency of justice between communities that have different and competing claims on the same place. Those currencies are not convertible into the currencies that appear in budget documents, but they are real, and the failure to account for them is itself a form of cost. The city above the sandstone is a city that does not fully know what it is built on. That is a description of a fact, not a moral judgment. But the fact has implications that extend into the moral domain, because knowing what a city is built on is part of what it means to take responsibility for the city, for what it does and what it has done and what it will do with the country it occupies. Sydney does not fully take that responsibility yet, not because the people who live in it are unwilling to, because the institutions that manage the city have not yet created the conditions in which that responsibility can be taken. The underground history of Sydney is one of the places where those conditions still need to be created. The harbour at night is a different thing from the harbour in the day. Most people know this, in the ordinary sense of having seen both, and noticed that they are different. The daytime harbour is performance. The ferry wakes, the bridge catching the morning light, the opera house shells above the quay, the whole orchestrated visual grammar of Sydney making itself legible and welcoming to everyone who looks at it. The nighttime harbour is something else. Not hostile, not cold, but older, quieter, less interested in being looked at. In the nighttime harbour, the city pulls back from itself in a way. The lights are present, but they are reflections, not the things themselves. And reflections have a different quality to them. Less certain, more contingent on the water being still. The sandstone that frames the harbour is dark at night, the warm honey colour hidden, and what you see instead is the shape of it, the mass of it, the way it sits in the landscape, with the permanence of something that predates all the structures above it. The Gadigal country around the harbour was managed and occupied and known for a very long time before anyone built anything on it that left the kind of permanent mark that colonial construction leaves. The knowledge of it was held in the names of places, in the routes between places, in the protocols for moving through different areas of country, in the ceremonies and the stories that encoded how the country worked and what each part of it was for. Some of that knowledge was lost in the disruption of the colonial period. The extent of the loss is itself uncertain, because one of the things that was disrupted was the transmission of knowledge between generations, and the degree to which a particular kind of knowledge survived or did not survive varies by the kind of knowledge and the circumstances of the particular community in the particular period. Some knowledge was protected by being held privately, transmitted only to those who needed to hold it. Some knowledge was lost because the people who held it died before they could transmit it. Some knowledge was lost because the conditions that made it relevant, the specific places and practices it related to, were disrupted to the point where the knowledge was no longer needed in the way it had been needed. The underground knowledge, the knowledge of what was in the sandstone and how it was accessed and what it was used for, is knowledge of a kind that is most likely to have been held privately, as the accounts of underground stories from elders suggest it was. Knowledge of private places, places not meant for general access, tends to be protected by being held privately, transmitted in contexts that are not available to outsiders and not visible in the records that outsiders produce. The colonial records would not contain explicit accounts of this knowledge, even if the knowledge survived intact, because the knowledge was not intended to be recorded in the colonial record. This is one of the reasons the pattern of almost evidence in the engineering records is so significant. It is in some ways the only version of the underground knowledge that appears in the public record. The direct knowledge is held by the communities that hold it, accessible only through the kind of respectful and properly structured engagement that the investigation would need to include. The indirect knowledge, the traces left in the rock and in the construction records by the encounters between colonial engineering and pre-colonial infrastructure, is what is available in the archive. And it is enough, if read carefully and with the right questions, to trace the outline of what is there. Tracing outlines is not the same as knowing what is inside them. The outline described in this video is the outline of a pattern of features concentrated in specific areas of the Sydney CBD, features that multiple independent observers over more than 2 centuries have described in terms consistent with deliberate construction rather than natural formation, features that have been consistently avoided or set aside rather than investigated, features whose investigation would require the partnership of communities that have their own knowledge of what is underground, but that have not been asked, in any systematic or properly resourced way, to share that knowledge in the context of an investigation. The partnership is the key. Not the technology, and not the archive, and not the geotechnical surveys, important as all of those are. The partnership between the research institutions and the Transport Authority and the heritage agencies and the Gadigal and Eora communities is what would make an investigation of this kind meaningful rather than merely technical. The survey results and the chemical analysis and the dating evidence would produce data. The partnership would produce meaning. And meaning is what the question is ultimately about. What was in the sandstone? Who put it there? What was it for? When was it last used? These are technical questions that technical investigation can address. But they are also questions about the life of a community over many thousands of years, about the relationship between that community and this particular piece of country, about what the country meant, and what it was for, and how its underground dimension was part of its meaning. Those questions cannot be answered by technology alone. They require the knowledge that the communities carry, the knowledge that the engineering records can only gesture toward from the outside. That knowledge exists. It is not lost. It is held in forms that are not always compatible with the documentary and technical forms that academic and institutional research typically uses, but it is there. And the investigation that this question warrants would bring those forms together, would create conditions in which the community knowledge and the archival record and the geophysical data could be read alongside one another rather than in isolation. That reading, if it were done properly, would produce an account of what is beneath Sydney that would be richer than anything the technical investigation alone could produce. Not just a map of void spaces in the sandstone. Not just a confirmation or disconfirmation of the pattern of evidence assembled from the construction records, but an account of what those spaces meant and what they were for, and what the people who created them knew about the country that the city above them has not yet fully understood. That account would change the city's understanding of itself, not immediately and not uniformly and not without resistance, but it would change it. The way that every substantive historical discovery changes the story a community tells about itself, by adding dimensions that were not previously visible, and by requiring the existing dimensions to be recontextualized in relation to the new ones. Sydney has not had that kind of change to itself under the discoveries that have changed the picture of pre-contact Aboriginal Australia in recent decades, the ancient DNA findings, the revised occupational dates, the rethinking of land management and architectural complexity have changed the national picture, but they have not produced a corresponding revision in the local, specifically Sydney, understanding of what Gadigal country was and what its underground dimension might have contained. The underground history of Sydney is one of the places where that local revision remains to be done. The revision is possible. The evidence that would drive it is, in some sense, already there, under the city, waiting for the investigation that has been deferred for more than 2 centuries. The communities that carry the complementary knowledge are there as well, above the sandstone, continuing the connection to country that the colonial period tried and failed to sever. The connection is the thing that matters most, not the passages themselves, not the dressed stone chambers, not the dry, still air of a space that has not been entered in 40 years, or perhaps in much longer. The connection between the people and the country, a connection that extends underground as well as across the surface, that includes the knowledge of what is below as well as what is above, that has survived everything that the colonial period threw at it. That connection is still there. The investigation, when it happens, will find it. And the finding will be the beginning of a different kind of understanding of the city, one that goes all the way down to the sandstone and all the way back to the beginning of the human occupation of this remarkable piece of country. Sleep well. The connection is still there. The sandstone is still there. The question is still open, patient as stone, waiting for the day when it is finally, properly, in full partnership with those who know it best, answered. The question that this video has been circling around, which is the question of what is beneath Sydney and why nobody has gone to find out, is in some ways a very simple question. In other ways, it is one of the most complex questions that can be asked about a place. The question of what a city does not know about itself and why it does not know it and what the not knowing costs. Simple questions and complex questions are not always easily distinguished from the outside. What makes this one look simple is the directness of the physical question. Go look. What is there? What makes it complex is everything that stands between the asking and the looking. The institutional frameworks, the heritage laws and their gaps, the funding structures and their priorities, the community relationships and their histories, the political context and its pressures, the scholarly debates and their internal dynamics, the archive access procedures and their restrictions. All of that complexity is real. It is not invented. It is not a smokescreen for something simpler. It is the actual texture of what it takes to do something like this. Investigation in a city like this, one in a country, with this particular history. But complexity is not an excuse for inaction indefinitely. Complexity explains why something is hard. It does not explain why something that is hard is not done for decades, and then for a century, and then for 2 centuries. The explanation for that duration requires something else, something that sits behind the complexity and that the complexity sometimes serves to obscure, a preference, institutional or political or cultural, for not knowing. The preference for not knowing is the thing that the 2 centuries of encounter and file and move on describes. It is not stated as a preference. It does not appear in any policy document or administrative guideline, but it is the effective result of the pattern of decisions that has been made consistently across the full span of Sydney's underground construction history. The effect of those decisions, consistently pursued for 2 centuries, is that the city does not know what is in its sandstone. And the consistency of the not knowing, in a context where knowing would have been possible at many points if different decisions had been made, suggests that the not knowing has been, at some level, preferred. Preferred does not mean desired. It means chosen, in the sense of that being the outcome that the pattern of choices produced, even if no individual decision-maker thought of themselves as choosing not to know. The project manager who told the 1,980 construction engineer that the specialist investigation could wait did not think of themselves as choosing not to know what is beneath Sydney. They thought of themselves as making a scheduled decision. But the cumulative effect of many scheduled decisions of that kind is indistinguishable from a preference for not knowing. Reversing that preference requires more than reversing individual decisions. It requires creating institutional conditions in which the preference for knowing, for genuine and properly structured investigation conducted in partnership with the communities most centrally affected, becomes the default rather than the exception. Those conditions have not yet been created, but they are more possible now than they have been at any earlier point in the history of the question. The conditions that would need to exist include a properly resourced research program, housed in an institution or group of institutions with the capacity to conduct the relevant technical work. They include formal partnership agreements with the Gadigal and Eora communities that give those communities real authority over the investigation, including the authority to direct the focus of the investigation and to determine what is done with the findings. They include changes to the access provisions that currently restrict some of the relevant transport authority and other institutional archives. And they include a public conversation about the underground history of Sydney that creates sufficient awareness of the question and sufficient support for investigating it that the institutional conditions can be created, sustained. This video is a contribution to that public conversation, a small one. The question is larger than any single contribution, but the accumulation of contributions, the videos and the journal articles and the heritage reports and the community discussions and the archival research is what the public conversation is made of. And the public conversation is what the institutional conditions are eventually made of. There is something important in the fact that the evidence described in this video has been there in the archives, in the construction records, in the engineering diaries for a very long time. It has not been assembled in this form before, not in a form accessible to a general audience. But the individual pieces have been there. The 1921 report has been in the state archives since it was filed. The 1,862 field notes have been in the archive since they were written. The 1,980 construction diary has been in whatever archive holds it since the Eastern Suburbs Railway was completed. The pieces have been waiting, as patient as the sandstone itself, for someone to read them in a way that assembled them into a pattern. That reading has happened in fragments by different researchers at different times. What has not happened is the full assembly, the putting of all the pieces together in one place, in one form, that makes the pattern visible and the question unavoidable. The hope of this video is that it contributes to that assembly, that it makes the pattern a little more visible, that it makes the question a little more unavoidable, that it reaches people who will carry the question with them, who will remember that there are passages in the sandstone beneath Sydney whose air has not moved since the last time someone walked through them, who will ask, when Sydney's infrastructure decisions are being made, whether this time will be different, whether this project will be the one that conducts the investigation, rather than deferring it. The question is worth carrying. It is not a comfortable question. It does not resolve into easy conclusions. It sits at the intersection of technical and historical and political and moral considerations that do not have simple solutions. But uncomfortable questions about difficult histories are the questions that matter most, and carrying them is part of what it means to take seriously the place where you are and the full depth of its history. Sydney is a deep place, not only in the geological sense, though it is that, not only in the architectural sense, though it is that too, with its layers of colonial and post-colonial construction piled on top of one another across 2 centuries. It is deep in the sense that its full history extends far below what is currently visible, both literally and metaphorically. The passages in the sandstone, if they are there, are the literal version of that depth. The knowledge that the Gadigal and Eora communities carry is the metaphorical version, the depth of understanding that comes from 65,000 years of knowing a place intimately. Both versions of that depth deserve to be known. Both deserve to be incorporated into the city's understanding of itself. The investigation of the underground features is one way into that incorporation. Not the only way, but a way that is available, in principle, now. with the technology and the frameworks and the researchers and the communities all present. The city above the sandstone is a remarkable city. Its harbour is one of the most beautiful natural harbours on Earth. Its buildings range from colonial sandstone to glass towers with everything in between. Its people come from everywhere, and the result is a culture that is in some ways the most genuinely multicultural thing that human civilization has so far produced. It is a city with a great deal to be proud of. But it is also a city built on top of something it does not fully know. Built on top of a history it has not fully reckoned with. Built on top of passages and chambers in the sandstone that have been there since before any of the rest of it was built, and that are still there now, waiting with the patience of stone for the day when the city is ready to find out what they are. That day will come. It has to come. Not because the evidence is overwhelming, though the pattern is compelling. Not because the institutional conditions are ideal, though they are more favorable than they have been, but because the question itself will not stop being asked. It has been asking itself in engineering diaries and archive reports and local history journals and short newspaper pieces that did not attract sustained attention for 200 years. It will continue to ask itself, and the asking accumulates. The accumulation eventually becomes undeniable. We are not there yet, but we are closer than we have been, and the sandstone is patient. The sandstone has been patient for 230 million years, and it will be patient for whatever time remains between now and the day when the investigation finally happens and the city finds out what it has been built on. Until then, the passages are there, the air in them is still, and wherever you are tonight, and whatever time it is, the country beneath your feet is older than the structures above it, and the people who knew it best before those structures were built left marks in it that have not yet been found by the people who came after. That is the world. It is deeper than it looks. Sleep well. The way that questions persist matters. Not all questions persist in the same way. Some questions persist by being actively debated, by appearing regularly in academic journals and public conversations, by generating the kind of controversy that keeps them alive in the discourse. Other questions persist by being quietly carried by the small number of people who know about them and who keep asking them in contexts that do not always receive them with enthusiasm, by the accumulation of evidence that builds slowly in archives and engineering records and oral traditions without ever quite reaching the critical mass that forces a broader reckoning. The question of what is beneath Sydney has persisted in the second way. It has not generated controversy because it has not been public enough to generate controversy. It has been carried quietly by the heritage officer and the retired engineer and the community member and the graduate student and the geologist and the researcher with 2 papers in specialist journals, by people who encountered a piece of the question and who kept it with them because the piece they encountered was compelling enough to keep. Quiet persistence is not the same as urgency, but it is not insignificant either. The questions that persist quietly over long periods, that are carried by people who have no institutional incentive to carry them but who carry them anyway because the questions feel important, tend to be questions that are in fact important. The importance is what produces the persistence, in the absence of the controversy that would produce a louder form of attention. The importance of the Sydney Underground question is not hard to articulate. It is a question about what happened to the knowledge of a place during the period when the people who held that knowledge were being systematically dispossessed and marginalized, and whose cultural heritage was being treated as of less than zero importance by the institutions that replaced them. It is a question about whether that knowledge can be recovered, not in its fullest form, not as though the dispossession had not happened, but in the partial and reconstructed form that honest investigation of the available evidence makes possible. And it is a question about what the city that was built above the knowledge owes to the communities that held it. Those are important questions. They are not the only important questions. There are many other questions about the history and present of Australia that are equally important and that have received more attention than the underground history of Sydney. But the underground history is one expression of the same underlying questions, and it is an expression that has specific and potentially recoverable physical evidence attached to it, evidence that would not be available for most of the other expressions of those questions. The physical evidence is the unusual thing about this particular question. Most questions about the suppression of Aboriginal cultural heritage are questions about practices that have not left physical traces that can be investigated now, about knowledge that was lost without a physical correlate that could be recovered, about history that can be reconstructed only through documentary evidence and oral tradition. The underground features of Sydney are different. They are, if they are there, physical features in physical rock, subject to investigation by physical methods, capable of producing the kind of unambiguous physical evidence that other aspects of this history cannot produce. That is what makes the investigation potentially so significant, and what makes its continued deferral so frustrating to those who understand the question. You cannot investigate an oral tradition in the way that you can investigate a void in sandstone. The methods are different, and the epistemological status of the results is different. A ground-penetrating radar image of a 30-foot square chamber at 40 feet below the town hall station would be a different kind of evidence from an elder's account of underground spaces of cultural significance, however consistent the two might be. Both are evidence. The physical evidence has a particular kind of weight in institutional context that the oral tradition does not, for reasons that reflect the biases of those institutional contexts as much as any genuine epistemological difference. That weight, the institutional weight of physical evidence, is part of what the investigation would produce. Not only the knowledge of what is there, but the kind of evidence that the institutions that need to respond to the knowledge are best equipped to respond to. The investigation would produce results in a form that the heritage agencies and the Transport Authority and the universities and the government departments can engage with using their existing frameworks, even as it would simultaneously demonstrate the need for new frameworks to manage the implications of those results. That combination results in existing frameworks plus implications requiring new frameworks, is the usual structure of paradigm-challenging discoveries. The discovery itself is containable within some existing categories, which is how it gets acknowledged and documented, but it exceeds other existing categories in ways that require those categories to be revised. The revision takes time and generates resistance, and is always incomplete. But it happens, gradually, because the evidence does not go away and the questions do not stop being asked. The questions about what is beneath Sydney will not stop being asked. The evidence that prompts them is in the archive, and it is real, and it will continue to be found by researchers and graduate students and journalists and heritage officers and community members for as long as people are curious about the underground history of the city. Each finding adds to the accumulation. Each telling of the pattern adds to the public awareness. Each person who carries the question adds to the weight of attention that eventually produces the conditions for investigation. You are now one of those people, in a small way, having spent this time with this question. You know about the 1862 surveyor and the 9-foot passage oriented to the north-northeast. You know about the 1871 engineer and the 30-foot square chamber of dressed stone at 40 feet below the Paddington Reservoir site. You know about pages 11 through 13 of the 1921 NSW Department of Public Works report, the pre-existing voids of undetermined origin in the town hall and circular key zones, the recommendation to avoid rather than investigate. You know about the 11-day gap in the 1980 construction diary and the underlined word outstanding and the dry, still air of the passage near St. James Station. You know the shape of the question. And knowing the shape of a question is not nothing. It is the beginning of the carrying. The carrying does not require you to do anything in particular. It does not require you to contact heritage agencies or write to your local member or commission a geophysical survey. It requires only that you hold the question with the seriousness it deserves, that you remember that the ground beneath Sydney's streets is older than the streets, and that the people who managed that ground for tens of thousands of years left marks in it that have not been found by the people who came after. That memory, distributed across enough people in enough contexts, is what eventually changes the institutional conditions that have made the question so persistently unanswerable. Not through any organized effort necessarily. Through the ordinary workings of a society in which more people are paying more attention to questions that have been overlooked and demanding, in the modest ways that people demand things, that the overlooking stop. The sandstone does not need the question to be answered. The sandstone is fine either way. 230 million years has given it a perspective on the urgency of human questions that is usefully humbling. The passages in it, if they are there, are fine. They are dry and they are stable, and they are in the excellent care of the most durable building material in the Greater Sydney region. But the people above the sandstone need the question to be answered. The Gadigal and Eora communities need it. The researchers who have been carrying it need it. The city itself, if a city can be said to need anything, needs it. Because a city that does not fully know what it is built on is a city that is missing a dimension of its own story. The dimension is waiting. The sandstone is patient. And the night is getting late in whatever part of the world you are listening from. And the question will still be there in the morning, and there will be another night after that, and another question, and another layer of almost evidence accumulating in archives that are patient in their own way, patient the way paper is patient, quietly holding what was written on it until someone comes to read. Someone will come to read. That is the thing that the 200 years of construction records tells us, if it tells us nothing else. The reading happens eventually. The pattern becomes visible eventually. The question becomes unavoidable eventually. And when it does, the sandstone will still be there with what it knows, waiting to tell it to anyone who finally asks it properly. That is where the story is tonight. In the waiting, in the patience, in the stillness of an air that has not moved in 40 years, or perhaps in much longer, in a passage beneath a city that does not know the passage is there. Sleep well. The stone is waiting. So is the question. Both of them are very good at it. The afternoon that the geologist made her observation about the St. James Passage, she and the graduate student had been sitting in a small meeting room in the geology department for about 2 hours. The interview had run longer than scheduled. The geologist had been more forthcoming than the graduate student expected, which was partly because the graduate student had asked better questions than the geologist usually got in interviews, and partly because the subject had opened something in the geologist that the routine professional interviews about bedrock mechanics and foundation design did not open. When the geologist said that she was no longer certain of her assumption that the construction records described misidentified natural features, she looked out the window for a moment before she continued. She said, "The problem with sandstone, the thing that takes a long time to understand about it, is that it is a very honest material. It does not hide what has been done to it. Worked surfaces look worked. Wear patterns look worn. If the rock shows what those records describe, then what those records describe is what was there." The graduate student asked what the geologist thought should happen next. The geologist thought for a moment. Then she said, "Someone should go look." That is what should happen next. Someone should go look. With the right instruments and the right questions and the right people involved from the beginning, not at the end. And then whatever is there should be dealt with honestly, whatever it turns out to be. The graduate student wrote that down in her field notes. Someone should go look. She underlined it. Not because she was planning to include it in the dissertation, which she was not, but because it seemed like the most useful thing anyone had said in the 2 years she had been researching the underground history of Sydney, and she wanted to remember that she had heard it. The dissertation was submitted. The observation was not included. The field notes went into a box with the rest of the research materials, and the box went into storage. Somewhere in that storage, in the handwriting of a graduate student who has since moved on to other work in a different field, is a single underlined sentence. that summarizes the entire history of the question better than anything produced by the engineers and the archivists and the bureaucrats who have been encountering and filing and moving on for 200 years. Someone should go look. It is not a complicated idea. It is the simplest possible response to the pattern of evidence described throughout this video. The pattern says there is something there. The response to that pattern, properly calibrated to the weight of the evidence, is to go and find out whether there is something there, not to assert that there is. Not to declare the question answered before it has been investigated, but to go and find out. The difficulty in going and finding out is real, but it is not insuperable. It requires money, which is finite but obtainable if the right people are persuaded that the question is worth answering. It requires access, which is restricted but not permanently closed if the right institutional conversations happen in the right order. It requires partnership with the Gadigal and Eora communities, which is not guaranteed, but which is possible if the approach is right and the respect is genuine, and the communities are given real authority over the investigation, rather than being managed through a formal consultation process designed to produce the appearance of engagement without its substance. None of those conditions exist fully right now. Some of them are closer to existing than they were 10 years ago. The trajectory, measured across decades rather than years, is in the direction of the conditions becoming more available rather than less. The scholarly context is more open to this kind of question than it was. The legal frameworks are more developed than they were. The technology is more capable than it was. The communities are more resourced and more legally empowered than they were. The direction is right. The pace is slow. And the sandstone is patient with the pace, as it is patient with everything, because its sense of time makes human impatience look like a brief flicker of light at the surface of something very deep and very old. There is a school group in Sydney, most years, that visits the sandstone engravings at one of the preserved sites in the national park north of the city. The teacher explains what the engravings are and how old they are and who made them, and the children look at the figures carved into the flat rock surface and they ask questions. Some of the questions are practical. Some of them are the kind of question that children ask because they do not yet know that adults have agreed not to find the question interesting. One of those questions, asked in some version by some child in most of these school visits, is there more? Is there more of this somewhere? Are there other places where they left things? The teacher usually says, yes, there are other sites, and describes some of them. The question the child was asking is almost certainly not that question. The question the child was asking, in the way that children ask questions that point at things the adults around them have learned not to point at, was something more like, how much of what they did is still here? How much of what was made in this place before any of us arrived is still somewhere in this place, waiting to be found? The answer to that question is more than we know. Certainly more than the formal record of encounters and filings and administrative settings aside would suggest. Possibly much more. The sandstone that holds the engravings on the surface holds other things below the surface, and the 2 centuries of not going to find out what those things are do not mean they are not there. They mean they are there and unknown, which is a different situation from being there and known, and a different situation, again, from not being there at all. The child who asks that question will probably grow up and find other things to think about. The question gets buried, for most people, under the accumulated weight of the things that adult life requires you to think about instead. But some of them will not lose it entirely. Some of them will carry it into adult life in the form of an interest, a curiosity, a sense that the official account of what is in the ground beneath the city is incomplete in ways that matter. Some of them will become researchers or engineers or community members who encounter a piece of the question and find that they cannot quite let it go. That is how the question has survived for as long as it has. Not through institutions, not through funded research programs, through the individual persistence of people who encountered some version of it and could not put it down. The heritage officer who keeps the files, The geologist who looked out the window before she said that the rock does not hide what has been done to it. The graduate student who underlined a sentence in her field notes and put it in a box. The community member who knows the underground stories and who looks at the construction records and recognizes something in the language the engineers used to describe what they found. These people are the continuity of the question. They are the reason it is still here to be asked, still here to be described in a video that is probably being watched by someone who is somewhere between awake and asleep, who is in some time zone that may or may not correspond to the time zone where Sydney is, who has been listening to this story about passages in sandstone and archive gaps and a word underlined in a construction diary, and who is now, if this has done what it set out to do, somewhere closer to being one of the people who carries the question than they were when the video started. The question needs carriers. It has never had enough of them. The official record has never been enough to sustain it. The carriers have been individuals, acting without coordination, finding their way to the question from different directions, and then holding it without knowing that others are holding it too. The possibility of those people finding each other, of the partial pictures they each hold being combined into something closer to a full picture, is one of the things that makes the present moment slightly more hopeful than earlier moments in the history of the question. The researcher who published 2 papers in specialist journals does not know the heritage officer. The heritage officer does not know the retired engineer. The retired engineer does not know the Gadigal community member who has been sitting with the underground stories and looking at construction records that describe things she recognizes. None of them know about the field notes in the box. None of them know about this video, yet. But the picture they each hold is the same picture, approached from different angles. And the picture, assembled from all those angles, is more complete than any of its parts. The passages are in the sandstone. The 1921 report is in the archive. The diary entry with the underlined word is in the Transport Authority's records. The oral tradition is in the community. The geologist's observation is in a box in someone's storage. All of it is still there. None of it has gone anywhere. The sandstone holds its part of the picture with the indifference of something that does not need the picture to be seen in order to exist. The archive holds its part with the patience of paper, which is less than the patience of stone but sufficient. The community holds its part with the active, intentional persistence of people who know that what they carry matters and who carry it accordingly. The question is distributed across all of these. It lives in no single place. It is not in the control of any single person or institution. It cannot be resolved by a single decision or a single investigation. It will be answered, if it is answered, by the convergence of many efforts, some of them technical, and some of them archival, and some of them conversational, and some of them political, over a period of time that is probably longer than any individual involved in any of those efforts will live to see completed. That is not a discouraging thought, although it might sound like one. It is an accurate thought, which is a different thing. Accurate thoughts about long-term questions are not discouraging. They are orienting. They tell you where you are in the trajectory of the question, and where you are in the trajectory of this question is closer to the beginning than the end, which means there is still everything to do, and the doing of it matters. The city above the sandstone does not know this. The city is not the kind of thing that knows things, but the people in the city can know it, and some of them do, and more of them will. The knowing spreads in the same way that the question spreads, through the ordinary channels of human curiosity and conversation, and the passing of attention from one person to another, until there are enough people paying attention, that the attention changes what the institutions do. That day is ahead. The sandstone is between here and it, patient and unchanging, holding whatever it holds in the dark and the dryness and the stillness that the engineers described when they found the passages and then moved on. The air in those passages has not moved since the last time someone walked through them, which may be 1980 and the Eastern Suburbs Railway crew, or maybe much earlier, centuries or longer, depending on what is there and when it was last used. The stillness of that air is the most evocative detail in the whole story. Still air is old air. It is air that has been in the same place for a very long time, that has reached an equilibrium with the rock around it, that has not been disturbed by the movement of bodies, or the heat of breath, or the flicker of any light. The workers who entered the passage in September 1980 and described the air as completely still were describing something that most people never encounter, a place that has not been entered in living memory, or longer, a place whose quiet is the quiet of genuine absence rather than the quiet of an empty room. That quality of absence is what the sandstone holds, not emptiness, absence. The particular character of a place that was once present, that was used and entered and understood, and that then became unreachable, not because it was destroyed, but because the connections to it were severed, one, by the disruptions of the colonial period and the institutional habits of the city that was built above it. Reconnecting to it is the work. The technical work and the archival work and the community work and the political work and the conversational work that this video is one small part of. The reconnection will not be simple. Nothing that has been severed for 2 centuries is reconnected simply. But it is possible. The passage is still there. The community knowledge is still there. The archival record is still there. The technology to investigate is there. The researchers who want to ask the question properly are there. What is needed is the moment when enough of these things come together that the investigation becomes unavoidable rather than deferrable. That moment has not arrived. But the story of how it will arrive is already being written in the small choices of the people who carry the question and who refuse, in the quiet way of people who cannot quite let something go to stop asking it. This has been a long time in the underground of Sydney. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, the city of the question is still there, below the trains and the buildings and the streets, in the sandstone that was old before anything else here was. The passages are dark and the air is still, and the dressed stone of the chambers is unchanged. And the question that has been accumulating, detail by patient detail, for more than 2 centuries, is still open. If you watch this to fall asleep, you are probably already there. If you are still with us, thank you for staying. There are more questions like this one. More places where the ground holds more than the surface admits. More archives with their almost statements and their underlined words and their recommendations that were not followed up. We will be back with more of them. Sleep well. The sandstone holds its silence. So does the question. Both of them are very, very good at it. The night is quiet, the sandstone is quiet. The passages beneath the city are quiet in the way that only very old things are quiet, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of things that have said everything they need to say and are now simply waiting, patient as stone, for the day when someone arrives to hear it. That day is not tonight. Tonight is for sleep, and for the carrying of questions that do not resolve, and for the particular kind of rest that comes from having spent time with something that matters. Sleep well. The question will be here when you wake. There is something worth saying about what happens when a question is held for a very long time without being answered, not to the question itself, which does not change, but to the people who hold it. The holding changes them in ways that are not always comfortable and not always visible to the people around them. The heritage officer who keeps the files about Sydney's underground goes home in the evenings to a life that has nothing to do with sandstone or archive gaps or construction diaries. She cooks or reads or talks to her family about the ordinary things that families talk about. But the question is there, in the background. The way a persistent low sound is there even when you are not consciously listening for it. It shapes how she looks at the city. She cannot ride the trains through the underground sections of the network without thinking about what is in the rock beside the tunnels. She cannot walk through the CBD without being aware, in some part of her mind, of the depth below her feet. That awareness is not a burden, exactly. It is more like a dimension that most people do not perceive, an additional layer of reality that the question has opened up in her relationship with the place. She sees the city the way a geologist sees a cliff face, not just as a surface, but as a record, as something that can be read, as something that contains more information than is immediately visible. The retired engineer has something similar, though he describes it differently. He says he thinks about the briefing sometimes when he is sitting in traffic above the town hall area when the car is stopped and he has a moment to look at the buildings and the street and to think about what is below them. He says he does not regret the decisions that were made during the metro project. He understands them. He made decisions like that himself. Decisions where the schedule and the budget and the available information pointed in one direction, and that direction was followed. But he thinks about the briefing. He thinks about the way the presenter described the zone quickly and in general terms. He thinks about what that quickness was covering. The Gadigal community member does not describe the question as something she carries, the way the heritage officer and the engineer carry it. For her, it is not an additional layer on top of a relationship that would otherwise be complete. It is part of the relationship itself. The underground is part of the country. The stories about it are part of the knowledge of the country. The fact that the colonial and post-colonial record does not acknowledge what the stories describe is not a gap in her understanding of the place. It is a gap in the colonial record, which is a different thing and a smaller thing, whatever its institutional weight might suggest. She has been asked, in the context of some community discussions about the intersection between heritage research and development projects, what she thinks the right process for investigating the underground features would be. She has answered this question carefully each time. She has said that the right process begins with the question of whose knowledge this is and who has the authority to determine how it is engaged with. That question is not answered by the heritage legislation, which provides some protections, but which was not designed by or for the communities whose heritage it covers. It has to be answered in conversation, in relationship, between the research institutions and the transport authority and the heritage agencies and the communities. And the conversation has to be a real one in which the communities have genuine authority, rather than a consultation in which the decision has already been made. She has also said that she thinks the investigation, if it is done properly, will find things that are significant, and that the significance will not be diminished by the fact that it took 200 years to look. The sandstone does not care how long it took. What is there will be what it is, regardless of when it is found. The meaning of it will be determined by the people who have the knowledge to interpret it, and those people are still here, and their knowledge is still held, and the finding will not be a discovery in the sense that implies the thing was previously unknown. It will be a confirmation, a reconnection, a moment when the physical evidence and the community knowledge and the archival record and the geological analysis are all brought into the same frame for the first time, and the picture that emerges from that convergence is something that none of its parts could produce alone. That is the finding that the question has been building toward for more than 2 centuries. Not a dramatic excavation that reveals a perfectly preserved underground city. Not a moment of theatrical revelation in which everything becomes clear at once. A convergence. A slow and careful and properly structured convergence of different kinds of knowledge held by different kinds of people about the same piece of country. The convergence is the finding. The finding is the convergence. And the convergence begins with the question, with the asking of it, and the carrying of it, and the refusal to put it down because the standard account does not have room for it. The question has been asked many times in many forms, and the asking has accumulated, even when the asking did not produce an investigation, even when the asking produced only a short article in a local history journal or a note in a graduate student's field notes, or a moment of looking out the window before saying that the rock does not hide what has been done to it. The accumulation is the foundation. The investigation that will eventually happen, in whatever form it takes, and on whatever timeline the institutional and community conditions allow, will be built on that foundation. Every person who has asked the question in any form is part of the foundation. Every person who carries the question after watching this video is part of the foundation. The foundation is the asking, and the asking does not stop. The sandstone is under the city. The city is over the sandstone. Between them, in the passages that 9-foot walls of worked stone line, and that level floors of worn rock floor, and that dry and still air fills, the question waits in the physical form that questions take when they are embedded in rock, patient, unchanged, ready to be answered whenever the people above it decide they want to know. Tonight is not that night. Tonight is for sleep, for the carrying of the question into the part of the mind that works on things without being asked to, the part that takes what the day has brought and holds it in the dark, and sometimes, when you wake, has something to show for the holding. Carry this one. It is worth the carrying. Sleep well. The stone waits. The sandstone will hold its end of the question, as it has always held it, with the patience of something that was